Explaining Postmodernism, Chapter 4, The Climate of Collectivism, From Postmodern Epistemology to Postmodern Politics. There's a problem with making epistemology fundamental to any explanation of postmodernism. The problem is the postmodernists' politics. If deep skepticism about reason and the consequent subjectivism and relativism were the most important parts of the story of postmodernism, then we would expect to find that postmodernists represent a roughly random distribution of commitments across the political spectrum. If values and politics are primarily a matter of a subjective leap into whatever fits one's preferences, then we should find people making leaps into all sorts of political programs. This is not what we find in the case of postmodernism. Postmodernists are not individuals who have reached relativistic conclusions about epistemology and then found comfort in a wide variety of political persuasions. Postmodernists are monolithically far left-wing in their politics. Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, and Richard Rorty are all far left. And so are Jacques Lacan, Stanley Fichte, Catherine MacKinnon, Andreas Huyssen, and Franklin Trichia. Of the major names in the postmodernist movement, there is not a single figure who is not left-wing in a serious way. So there is something else going on besides epistemology. Part of that something else is that postmodernists have taken to heart Frederick Jameson's remark that, quote, everything is, in the last analysis, political, unquote. The spirit of Jameson's remark lies behind the persistent postmodernist charge that epistemology is merely a tool of power, that all claims of objectivity and rationality mask oppressive political agendas. It stands to reason, then, that postmodern appeals to subjectivity and irrationality can also be in the service of political ends. But why? Another part of that something else is that leftist thought has dominated political thought among 20th century intellectuals, particularly among academic intellectuals. But even given that fact, the dominance of left thought among postmodernists is still a puzzle, since for most of socialism's intellectual history, it has almost always been defended on the modernist grounds of reason and science. Marx's socialism has been the most widespread form of far-left thought, and, quote, scientific socialism, unquote, was the Marxist self-descriptive phrase. A related puzzle is explaining why postmodernists, particularly among those postmodernists most involved with the practical applications of postmodernist ideas, or with putting postmodernist ideas into actual practice in their classrooms and in faculty meetings, are the most likely to be hostile to dissent and debate, the most likely to engage in ad hominem argument and name-calling, the most likely to enact, quote, politically correct, unquote, authoritarian measures, and the most likely to use anger and rage as argumentative tactics. Whether it is Stanley Fichte calling all opponents of affirmative action bigots and lumping them in with the Ku Klux Klan, or whether it is Andrea Dworkin's male bashing in the form of calling all heterosexual males rapists, the rhetoric is very often harsh and bitter. So the puzzling question is, why is it that among the far left, which has traditionally promoted itself as the only true champion of civility, tolerance, and fair play, that we find those habits least practiced and even denounced? Evidence, reason, logic, tolerance, and civility were all integral parts of the modernist package of principles. Socialism in its modern form began in part by accepting that package. The argument of the next 3 chapters. As modernists, the socialists argued that socialism could be proved by evidence and rational analysis, and that once the evidence was in, socialism's moral and economic superiority to capitalism would be clear to anyone with an open mind. This is significant because, so conceived, socialism committed itself to a series of propositions that could be empirically, rationally, and scientifically scrutinized. The end result of that scrutiny provides another key to explaining postmodernism. Classical Marxist socialism made 4 major claims. First, capitalism is exploitative. The rich enslave the poor. It is brutally competitive domestically and imperialistic internationally. Second, socialism, by contrast, is humane and peaceful. People share, are equal, and cooperative. Third, capitalism is ultimately less productive than socialism. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and the ensuing class conflict will cause capitalism's collapse in the end. Fourth, socialist economies, by contrast, will be more productive and usher in a new era of prosperity. These propositions were first enunciated by socialists in the 19th century and repeated often into the 20th century before disaster struck. The disaster was that all four of socialism's claims were refuted both in theory and in practice. In theory, the free market economists have won the debate. Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman have shown how markets are efficient, and they have shown, conversely, how socialist, top-down command economies necessarily must fail. Distinguished left-wing economists, such as Robert Heilbrunner, have conceded in print that the debate is over and that the capitalists have won. In theory, the moral and political debate is more up for grabs, but the leading thesis is that some form of liberalism in the broadest sense is essential to protecting civil rights and civil society in general. And the liveliest debates are about whether a conservative version of liberalism, a libertarian one, or a modified welfarist one is best. Many leftists are repackaging themselves as more moderate communitarians, but that repackaging itself shows how far the debate has shifted toward liberalism. The empirical evidence has been much harder on socialism. Economically, in practice, the capitalist nations are increasingly productive and prosperous with no end in sight. Not only are the rich getting fantastically richer, the poor in those countries are getting richer too. And by direct and brutal contrast, every socialist experiment has ended in dismal economic failure, from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc to North Korea and Vietnam to Cuba, Ethiopia, and Mozambique. Morally and politically, in practice, every liberal capitalist country has a solid record for being humane, for by and large respecting rights and freedoms, and for making it possible for people to put together fruitful and meaningful lives. Socialist practice has time and time again proved itself more brutal than the worst dictatorships in history prior to the 20th century. Each socialist regime has collapsed into dictatorship and begun killing people on a huge scale. Each has produced dissident writers such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Nian Cheng, who have documented what those regimes are capable of. These points are well known, and I dwell upon them in order to project the depth of the crisis that this meant for left socialist intellectuals. By the 1950s, the crisis was being felt deeply. Instead of having collapsed in the Great Depression of the 1930s, as both the collectivist right and the left had hoped, the liberal capitalist countries had recovered after World War II, and by the 1950s were enjoying peace, liberty, and new levels of prosperity. World War II had wiped out the collectivist right, the National Socialists and the Fascists, leaving the left alone in the field against a triumphant and full of itself liberal capitalism. Yet while the liberal West's recovery and its rising political and economic prominence were distressing to the far left intellectuals of the West, hope was still offered by the existence of the Soviet Union, the, quote, noble experiment, unquote, and to a lesser extent by communist China. Even that hope was brutally crushed in 1956. Before a worldwide audience, the Soviets sent tanks into Hungary to stifle demonstrations by students and workers, thus demonstrating just how strong was their commitment to humanity. And, more devastatingly, Nikita Khrushchev acknowledged publicly what many in the West had long charged, that Joseph Stalin's regime had slaughtered tens of millions of human beings, staggering numbers that made the National Socialist efforts seem amateurish by comparison. Responding to socialism's crisis of theory and evidence. From the Manifesto of the Communist Party of 1848 to the revelations of 1956 was over a century of theory and evidence. The crisis for the far left was that the logic and evidence were going against socialism. Put yourself in the shoes of an intelligent, informed socialist confronted with all this data. How would you react? You have a deep commitment to socialism. You feel that socialism is true and you want it to be true. Upon socialism, you have pinned all your hopes and dreams of a peaceful and prosperous future and all your hopes for solving the ills of our current society. This is a moment of truth for anyone who has experienced the agony of a deeply cherished hypothesis run aground on the rocks of reality. What do you do? Do you abandon your theory and go with the facts, or do you find a way to maintain your belief in your theory? Here, then, is my second hypothesis about postmodernism. Postmodernism is the academic far left's epistemological strategy for responding to the crisis caused by the failures of socialism in theory and in practice. A historically parallel example may help here. In the 1950s and 60s, the left faced the same dilemma that religious thinkers faced in the late 1700s. In both cases, the evidence was against them. During the Enlightenment, religion's natural theology arguments were widely seen as being full of holes, and science was rapidly giving naturalistic and opposed explanations for the things that religion had traditionally explained. Religion was in danger of being shut out of intellectual life. By the 1950s and 60s, the left's arguments for the fruitfulness and decency of socialism were failing in theory and practice, and liberal capitalism was rapidly increasing everyone's standard of living and showing itself respectful of human freedoms. By the late 1700s, religious thinkers had a choice: accept evidence and logic as the ultimate court of appeal, and thereby reject their deeply cherished religious ideals, or stick by their ideals and attack the whole idea that evidence and logic matter. Quote, "I had to deny knowledge," wrote Kant in the preface to the First Critique, "in order to make room for faith." Unquote. Quote, "Faith," wrote Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling, "requires the crucifixion of reason." Unquote. So he proceeded to crucify reason and glorify the irrational. The left thinkers of the 1950s and 1960s faced the same choice. As I will argue over the course of the next two chapters, the far left faced a dilemma. Confronted by the continued flourishing of capitalism and the continued poverty and brutality of socialism, they could either go with the evidence and reject their deeply cherished ideals, or stick by their ideals and attack the whole idea that evidence and logic matter. Some, like Kant and Kierkegaard, decided to limit reason, to crucify it. And for that purpose, Heidegger's exalting feeling over reason came as a godsend. And so did Kuhn's theory-laden paradigms, and Quine's pragmatic and internalist account of language and logic. That the leading postmodern intellectuals, from Foucault, Lyotard, and Derrida to Rorty and Fichte, came of age in the 1950s and 1960s, then is not a coincidence. Postmodernism is born of the marriage of left politics and skeptical epistemology. As socialist political thought was reaching a crisis in the 1950s, academic epistemology had in Europe come to take seriously Nietzsche and Heidegger, and in the Anglo-American world, it had seen the decline of logical positivism into Quine and Kuhn. The dominance of subjectivist and relativistic epistemologies in academic philosophy thus provided the academic left with a new tactic. Confronted by harsh evidence and ruthless logic, the far left had a reply. That is only logic and evidence. Logic and evidence are subjective. You cannot really prove anything. Feelings are deeper than logic, and our feelings say socialism. That is my second hypothesis. Postmodernism is a response to the crisis of faith of the academic far left. Its epistemology justifies the leap of faith necessary to continue believing in socialism, and that same epistemology justifies using language not as a vehicle for seeking truth, but as a rhetorical weapon in the continuing battle against capitalism. Back to Rousseau. The justification of that hypothesis requires an explanation of why the crisis of socialist thought was felt so deeply by the 1950s, and why, to a significant number of left intellectuals, the postmodern epistemological strategy seemed to be the only one available. The key part of that explanation requires showing why classical liberalism, despite its flourishing culturally, had become a dead issue in the minds of most intellectuals, especially European intellectuals. No matter what troubles the anti-liberal left and right ran into, a serious reconsideration of liberalism was not going to happen. Again, the story has its modern roots in the battle of the Enlightenment and the Counter-Enlightenment. This time the battle is over the Enlightenment's individualism and liberalism, best represented by the Lockeans, and the anti-individualism and anti-liberalism of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his followers. Rousseau is the most significant figure in the political Counter-Enlightenment. His moral and political philosophy was inspirational to Immanuel Kant, Johann Herder, Johann Fichte, and G.W.F. Hegel, and from them transmitted to the collectivist right. It was perhaps more inspirational to the collectivist left. Rousseau's writings were the Bible of the Jacobin leaders of the French Revolution, absorbed by many hopeful Russian revolutionaries of the late 19th century, and influential upon the more agrarian socialists of the 20th century in China and Cambodia. In the theoretical world of academic socialism, Rousseau's version of collectivism was eclipsed by Marx's version for most of the 19th century and much of the 20th century. Yet a large part of the explanation of postmodern thought is a shift toward Rousseauian themes by thinkers who were originally inspired by Marx, but who are now increasingly disillusioned. Rousseau's Counter-Enlightenment. The first great frontal assault on the Enlightenment was launched by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. Rousseau has a well-deserved reputation as the bad boy of 18th century French philosophy. In the context of Enlightenment intellectual culture, Rousseau's was a major dissenting voice. He was an admirer of all things Spartan, the Sparta of militaristic and feudal communalism, and a despiser of all things Athenian, the classical Athens of commerce, cosmopolitanism, and the high arts. Civilization is thoroughly corrupting, Rousseau argued, not only the oppressive feudal system of 18th century France, with its decadent and parasitical aristocracy, but also its Enlightenment alternative, with its exaltation of reason, property, the arts and sciences. Name a dominant feature of the Enlightenment, and Rousseau was against it. In his discourse on the origin of inequality, Rousseau started his attack on the foundation of the Enlightenment project, reason. The philosophes were exactly right that reason is the foundation of civilization. Civilization's rational progress, however, is anything but progress, for civilization is achieved at the expense of morality. There is an inverse relationship between cultural and moral development. Culture does generate much learning, luxury, and sophistication, but learning, luxury, and sophistication all cause moral degradation. The root of our moral degradation is reason, the original sin of humankind. Before their reason was awakened, humans were simple beings, mostly solitary, satisfying their wants easily by gathering from their immediate environment. That happy state was the ideal. Quote, "This author should have said that since the state of nature is the state in which the concern for our self-preservation is the least prejudicial to that of others, that state was consequently the most appropriate for peace and the best suited for the human race." Unquote. But by some unexplainable, unfortunate occurrence, reason was awakened, and once awakened, it disgorged a Pandora's box of problems upon the world, transforming human nature to the point that we can no longer return to our happy original state. As the philosophes were heralding the triumph of reason in the world, Rousseau wanted to demonstrate that, quote, "all the subsequent progress has been an appearance, so many steps toward the perfection of the individual, and in fact toward the decay of the species." Unquote. Once their reasoning power was awakened, humans realized their primitive condition, and this led them to feel dissatisfied. So they started to make improvements. these improvements culminating most strikingly in the agricultural and metallurgical revolutions. Undeniably, those revolutions improved mankind's material lot, but that improvement has in fact destroyed the species. Quote, "It is iron and wheat that have civilized men and ruined the human race." Unquote. The ruin took many forms. Economically, agriculture and technology led to surplus wealth. Surplus wealth in turn led to the need for property rights. Property, however, made humans competitive and led them to see each other as enemies. Physically, as humans became wealthier, they enjoyed more comforts and luxuries. But those comforts and luxuries caused physical degradation. They began to eat too much food and to eat decadent food, and thus became less healthy. They came increasingly to use tools and technologies, and thus became physically less strong. What was once a physically hardy species thus became dependent upon doctors and gadgets. Socially, with luxuries came an awakening of aesthetic standards for beauty, and those standards transformed their sex lives. What was once a straightforward act of copulation became tied to love, and love is messy and exclusive and preferential. Love accordingly awakened jealousy, envy, and rivalry, more things that set human beings against each other. Thus, reason led to the development of all of civilization's features: agriculture, technology, property, and aesthetics, and these made mankind soft, lazy, and in economic and social conflict with itself. But the story gets worse, for the ongoing social conflicts generated a few winners at the top of the social heap and many oppressed losers beneath them. Inequality became a prominent and damning consequence of civilization. Such inequalities are damning because all inequalities, quote, such as being richer, more honored, more powerful, are privileges enjoyed by some at the expense of others, unquote. Civilization, accordingly, became a zero-sum game along many social dimensions, the winners gaining and enjoying more and more, while the losers suffered and were left increasingly far behind. But civilization's pathologies became even worse, for the reason that made civilization's inequality possible also made the better off uncaring about the suffering of the less fortunate. Reason, according to Rousseau, is opposed to compassion. Reason generates civilization, which is the ultimate cause of the sufferings of the victims of inequality, but reason also then creates rationales for ignoring that suffering. Wrote Rousseau, quote, "Reason is what engenders egocentrism, and reflection strengthens it. Reason is what turns man in upon himself. Reason is what separates him from all that troubles him and afflicts him. Philosophy is what isolates him and what moves him to say in secret at the sight of a suffering man, 'Perish, if you will, I am safe and sound.'" Unquote. In contemporary civilization, this lack of compassion becomes more than a sin of omission. Rousseau argues that having succeeded in the competitions of civilized life, the winners now have a vested interest in preserving the system. Civilization's advocates, especially those who are living at the top of the heap, and therefore insulated from the worst of the harms, go out of their way to praise civilization's advances in technology, art, and science. But these advances themselves and the praise heaped upon them serve only to mask the harms that civilization does. Foreshadowing Herbert Marcuse and Foucault, Rousseau wrote in the essay that made him famous, The Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, quote, "Princes always view with pleasure the spread among their subjects of the taste for arts of amusement and superfluities," unquote. Such acquired tastes within a people, quote, "are so many chains binding it," unquote. Quote, "The sciences, letters, and arts, far from freeing and elevating mankind, spread garlands of flowers over the iron chains with which men are burdened, stifle in them the sense of that original liberty for which they seem to have been born, make them love their slavery, and turn them into what is called civilized peoples," unquote. So corrupt, accordingly, is the whole edifice of civilization that no reform is possible. Against the timid moderates who want to achieve the good society in piecemeal fashion, Rousseau called for revolution. Quote, "People were continually patching the state up, whereas they should have begun by clearing the air and putting aside all the old materials, as Lycurgus did in Sparta, in order to raise a good edifice later." Unquote. Rousseau's Collectivism and Statism. Once the corruption is totally swept away, the project of building a moral society can commence. Naturally, the good edifice to be raised must start from a good foundation. The primitive state of nature was good, but unfortunately we cannot return to it. Reason, once awakened, cannot be dulled entirely. But neither can we tolerate anything that would lead us back to contemporary advanced civilization. Fortunately, history provides us with good models. For looking back to most tribal cultures, we find that their societies, quote, maintaining a middle position between the indolence of our primitive state and the petulant activity of our egocentrism, must have been the happiest and most durable epoch. The more one reflects on it, the more one finds that this state was the least subject to upheavals and the best for man. Unquote. The best we can do, accordingly, is try to recreate in modern form a society on that model. The recreation must begin from a proper understanding of human nature. Contrary to the claims of the Enlightenment philosophers, Rousseau argued that man is naturally a passional animal, not a rational one. Man's deepest passions should set the direction of his life, and reason should always give way before them. Passions are an appropriate foundation for society, since one of the deepest desires is to believe in religion, and Rousseau believes religion is essential to social stability. That desire to believe can and must override all Enlightenment objections. Quote, "I believe, therefore, that the world is governed by a powerful and wise will. I see it, or rather, I sense it." Unquote. Rousseau's feelings that God exists, however, did not provide him with much detailed information about the nature of God. God, quote, "is equally hidden from my senses and from my understanding," unquote. So his feeling gave him only the sense that a powerful, intelligent, and good being created the world. The arguments of the philosophers about God not only did not clarify matters, they made things worse. Quote, "The more I think about it," Rousseau wrote, "the more I am confused," unquote. So he resolved to ignore the philosophers. Quote, "Suffused with the sense of my inadequacy, I shall never reason about the nature of God," unquote, and to let his feelings guide his religious beliefs, holding that feelings are a more reliable guide than reason. Quote, "I took another guide, and I said to myself, let us consult the inner light. It will lead me astray less than they lead me astray," unquote. Rousseau's inner light revealed to him an unshakable feeling that God's existence is the basis for all explanations, and that feeling was to him immune from revision and counter-argument. Quote, "One may very well argue with me about this, but I sense it, and this sentiment that speaks to me is stronger than the reason combating it," unquote. This feeling was not to be merely one of Rousseau's personal whims. At the foundation of all civil societies, Rousseau argued, one finds a religious sanction for what its leaders do. The society's founding leaders may not always genuinely believe in the religious sanctions they invoke, but their invoking them is nonetheless essential. If the people believe that their leaders are acting out the will of the gods, they will be more willing to obey freely and, quote, "bear with docility the yoke of the public good," unquote. Enlightenment reason, by contrast, leads to disbelief. Disbelief leads to disobedience, and disobedience leads to anarchy. This is a further reason why, according to Rousseau, quote, "the state of reflection is a state contrary to nature, and the man who meditates is a depraved animal," unquote. Reason, accordingly, is destructive to society and should be limited and replaced with natural passion. "So important is religion to a society," wrote Rousseau in The Social Contract, that the state cannot be indifferent to religious matters. It cannot pursue a policy of toleration for disbelievers or even view religion as a matter of individual conscience. It must, therefore, absolutely reject the Enlightenment's dangerous notions of religious toleration and the separation of church and state. Further, so fundamentally important is religion that the ultimate penalty is appropriate for disbelievers. Quote, "While the state can compel no one to believe, it can banish not for impiety, but as an antisocial being, incapable of truly loving the laws and justice, and of sacrificing, if needed, his life to duty. If, after having publicly recognized these dogmas, a person acts as if he does not believe them, he should be put to death." Unquote. A society properly founded on natural passion and religion will override the self-interested individualism that reason leads to, making it possible for individuals to form a new collectivized social organism. When individuals come together to form the new society, Rousseau writes, quote, "The individual particularity of each contracting party is surrendered to a new moral and collective body, which has its own self, life, body, and will." Unquote. The will of each individual is no longer that individual's own, but becomes common or general and under the direction of the spokesman for the whole. In moral society, one, quote, "coalesces with all, and in this each of us puts in common his person and his whole power under the supreme direction of society's leaders." Unquote. In the new society, the leadership expresses, quote, "the general will," unquote, and enacts policies that are best for the whole, thus enabling all individuals to achieve their true interests and their true freedom. The requirements of the general will absolutely override all other considerations. So, quote, "A citizen should render to the state all the services he can as soon as the sovereign demands them." Unquote. Yet there is something about human nature, corrupted as it is now by reason and individualism, that militates and always will militate against the general will. Individuals rarely see their individual wills as being in harmony with the general will. Consequently, Rousseau writes, quote, "the private will acts constantly against the general will." Unquote. And so to counteract these socially destructive individualistic tendencies, the state is justified in using compulsion. Quote, "Whoever refuses to obey the general will be forced to do so by the entire body. This means merely that he will be forced to be free." Unquote. The power of the general will over the individual will is total. Quote, "The state ought to have a universal compulsory force to move and arrange each part in the manner best suited to the whole." Unquote. And if the leaders of the state say to the citizen, quote, "It is expedient for the state that you should die," he should die. Unquote. We thus find in Rousseau an explicitly counter-Enlightenment set of themes, attacking the Enlightenment's themes of reason, the arts and sciences, and ethical and political individualism and liberalism. Rousseau was a contemporary of the American revolutionaries of the 1770s, and there is an instructive contrast between the Lockean themes of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in the Americans' Declaration of Independence and Rousseau's social contract oath for his projected constitution for Corsica. Quote, "I join myself, body, goods, will, and all my powers, to the Corsican nation, granting to her the full ownership of me, myself, and all that depends upon me." Unquote. Lockean Enlightenment politics and Rousseauian counter-Enlightenment politics will lead to opposite practical applications. Rousseau and the French Revolution. Rousseau died in 1778, when France was at the height of its Enlightenment. At the time of his death, Rousseau's writings were well known in France, though he had not exerted the influence that he would when France entered its revolution. It was Rousseau's followers who prevailed in the French Revolution, especially in its destructive third phase. The revolution had started with the nobility. Spotting the weakness of the French monarchy, the nobles had succeeded in 1789 in forcing a meeting of the Estates General, an institution that they usually controlled. Some of the nobles had hoped to enhance the power of the nobility at the expense of the monarchy, and some had hoped to institute Enlightenment reforms. The nobles, however, were unable to form a unified coalition, and they were no match for the vigor of the liberal and radical delegates. Control of events slipped out of the hands of the nobles, and the revolution entered a second, more liberal phase. The second phase was dominated by broadly Lockean liberals, and it was they who produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The liberals, however, were in their turn no match for the vigor of the most radical members of the revolution. As the members of the Girondin and Jacobin parties assumed greater power, the revolution entered its third phase. The Jacobin leaders were explicitly disciples of Rousseau. Jean-Paul Marat, who took on a disheveled and unbathed appearance, explained that he did so, quote, in order to live simply and according to the precepts of Rousseau, unquote. Louis de Saint-Just, perhaps the most bloodthirsty of the Jacobins, made his devotion to Rousseau clear in speeches to the National Convention. And speaking for the most radical of the revolutionaries, Maximilien Robespierre, expressed the prevailing adoring opinion of the great man. Quote, Rousseau is the one man who, through the loftiness of his soul and the grandeur of his character, showed himself worthy of the role of teacher of mankind. Unquote. Under the Jacobins, the revolution became more radical and more violent. Now the spokesmen for the general will, and having at their disposal plenty of the, quote, universal compulsory force, unquote, that Rousseau had dreamed about with which to combat recalcitrant private wills, the Jacobins found it expedient that many die. The guillotine was busy as the radicals ruthlessly killed nobles, priests, and just about anyone whose politics was suspect. Quote, we must not only punish traitors, urged Saint-Just, but all people who are not enthusiastic, unquote. The nation had plunged into a brutal civil war, and in enormously symbolic acts, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed in 1793. That only made things worse, and all of France declined into the reign of terror. The terror ended with the arrest and execution of Robespierre in 1794, but it was too late for France. Its energies were dissipated, the nation was exhausted, and a power vacuum emerged that Napoleon Bonaparte would fill. The story of the Counter-Enlightenment then shifts to the German states. Among German intellectuals, there had been some early sympathy for the French Revolution. German intellectuals were not ignorant of the Enlightenment in England and France. Several were attracted by Enlightenment themes, and in the mid-1700s, Frederick the Great had attracted to Berlin several Enlightenment-minded scientists and other intellectuals. Berlin, for a while, was a hotbed of French and English influences. For the most part, however, the Enlightenment had made few inroads among intellectuals in the German states. Politically and economically, Germany was a set of feudal states. Serfdom would not be abolished until the 19th century. The majority of the population was uneducated and agrarian. Most were deeply religious, dominantly Lutheran. Unthinking obedience to God and to one's feudal lord had been ingrained for centuries. This was especially true in Prussia, whose people Gotthold Lessing called, quote, the most servile in Europe, unquote. So among the Germans, the reports of the terror of the French Revolution caused horror. They killed their king and queen. They hunted down priests, cut off their heads, and paraded up and down the streets of Paris with the heads stuck upon the ends of pikes. Yet the lesson most German intellectuals took from the Revolution was not that Rousseauian philosophy was the culprit. To most, the culprit was clearly the Enlightenment philosophy. The Enlightenment was anti-feudal, they noted, and the Revolution was a practical demonstration of what that means, the wholesale slaughtering of one's sovereign lords and ladies. The Enlightenment was anti-religion, they noted, and the revolution is a practical demonstration of what that means, killing holy men and burning down churches. But from the German perspective, the situation became worse, for out of the power vacuum in France arose Napoleon. Napoleon was also provided an opportunity by a weakened feudal Europe. Europe's hundreds of small dynastic units were no match for Napoleon's new military tactics and his sheer audacity. Napoleon ran roughshod over old feudal Europe, swept into the German states, defeated the Prussians in 1806, and proceeded to change everything. From the perspective of the Germans, Napoleon was not only a foreign conqueror, he was a product of the Enlightenment. Where he conquered and ruled, he extended equality before the law, opened government offices to the middle class, and guaranteed private property. On matters of religion, he destroyed the ghettos, gave Jews freedom of religion, and gave them the right to own land and to practice all trades. He opened secular public schools and modernized Europe's transportation network. Napoleon outraged many powerful forces in doing so. He abolished guilds. He angered the clergy by abolishing church courts, tithes, monasteries, convents, ecclesiastical states, and he seized much church property. He angered the nobles by abolishing feudal estates and feudal dues, by breaking up large estates, and generally by lessening the power of the nobles over the peasantry. He functioned, in effect, from the Enlightenment perspective, as a benevolent dictator, as one who embraced many of the modern ideals, but who used the full force of government to impose them. His dictatorial impositions went further. He enacted censorship wherever he went, conscripted subjugated peoples to fight foreign battles, and taxed subjugated peoples to finance France. So now most German intellectuals faced a serious crisis. The Enlightenment, as they saw it, was not merely a foreign disaster across the Rhine. It was a dictatorial presence ruling Germany in the presence of Napoleon Bonaparte. How, wondered every German, did Napoleon win? What did the Germans do wrong? What was to be done? The poet Johann Hölderlin, Hegel's roommate in college, declared, quote, "Kant is the Moses of our nation," unquote. For the story of how the now-dead Kant was to lead Germany out of bondage, we return to Königsberg. Counter-Enlightenment politics, right and left collectivism. After Rousseau, collectivist political thinking divided into left and right versions, both versions drawing inspiration from Rousseau. The story of the left version is the subject of Chapter 5, so my purpose in this chapter is to highlight developments in collectivist right thinking, and to show that in its essentials, the collectivist right was pursuing the same broadly anti-liberal capitalist themes that the collectivist left was. What links the right and the left is a core set of themes: anti-individualism, the need for strong government, the view that religion is a state matter, whether to promote or suppress it, the view that education is a process of socialization, ambivalence about science and technology, and strong themes of group conflict, violence, and war. Left and right have often divided bitterly over which themes have priority and how they should be applied. Yet for all of their differences, both the collectivist left and the collectivist right have consistently recognized a common enemy: liberal capitalism, with its individualism, its limited government, its separation of church and state, its fairly consistent view that education is not primarily a matter of political socialization, and its persistent Whiggish optimism about the prospects for peaceful trade and cooperation between members of all nations and groups. Rousseau, for example, is often seen as being a man of the left, and he has influenced generations of left thinkers. But he was also inspirational to Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, all men of the right. Fichte was in turn used regularly as a model for right thinkers. But he was also an inspiration for left socialists, such as Friedrich Ebert, president of the Weimar Republic after World War I. Hegel's legacy, as is well known, took both a right and a left form. While the details are messy, the broad point is clear. The collectivist right and the collectivist left are united in their major goals and in identifying their major opposition. None of these thinkers, for example, ever has a kind word for the politics of John Locke. In the 20th century, the same trend continued. Scholars debated whether George Sorel is left or right. And that makes sense, given that he inspired and admired both Lenin and Mussolini. And to give just one more example, Heidegger and the thinkers of the Frankfurt School have much more in common politically than either does with, say, John Stuart Mill. This in turn explains why thinkers from Herbert Marcuse to Alexandra Koyeva to Maurice Merleau-Ponty all argued that Marx and Heidegger are compatible, but none ever dreamed of connecting either to Locke or Mill. The point will be that liberalism did not penetrate deeply into the main lines of political thinking in Germany. As was the case with metaphysics and epistemology, the most vigorous developments in social and political philosophy of the 19th and early 20th century occurred in Germany, and German socio-political philosophy was dominated by Kant, Fichte, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. By the early 20th century, accordingly, the dominant issues for most continental political thinkers were not whether liberal capitalism was a viable option, but rather exactly when it would collapse, and whether right or left collectivism had a best claim to being the socialism of the future. The defeat of the collectivist right in World War II then meant that the left was on its own to carry the socialist mantle forward. Accordingly, when the left ran into its own major disasters as the 20th century progressed, understanding its fundamental commonality with the collectivist right helps to explain why, in its desperation, the left has often adopted fascistic tactics. Kant on collectivism and war. Of the major figures in German philosophy in the modern era, Kant is perhaps the one most influenced by Enlightenment social thought. There is a clear intellectual connection between Rousseau and Kant. Biographers often repeat Heinrich Heine's anecdote about how Kant always took his afternoon walk at a set time, a time so regular that neighbors could set their clocks by his appearance. Except on one occasion, he was late for his walk because he had been so caught up in reading Rousseau's Emile that he lost track of time. Kant had been raised as a pietist, a version of Lutheranism that emphasized simplicity and eschewed external decoration. Kant therefore had no pictures or paintings hanging anywhere on the walls of his house, with one exception. Over his desk in his study hung a picture of Rousseau. Wrote Kant, quote, "I learned to honor mankind from reading Rousseau," unquote. Neo-Enlightenment thinkers attack Kant for two things: his skeptical and subjectivist epistemology and his ethic of selfless duty. Kant's account of reason divorces it from cognitive contact with reality, thus destroying knowledge. And his account of ethics divorces morality from happiness, thus destroying the purpose of life. As discussed in Chapter 2, Kant's powerful arguments were a mighty blow to the Enlightenment. Politically, however, Kant is sometimes considered to be a liberal, and in the context of 18th century Prussia, there is some truth to that. In the context of Enlightenment liberalism, however, Kant diverged from liberalism in two major respects: his collectivism and his advocacy of war as a means to collectivist ends. In a 1784 essay, Idea for a Universal History with Cosmopolitan Intent, Kant asserted that there is a necessary destiny for the human species. Nature has a plan. It is, however, quote, "a hidden plan of nature," unquote, and as such it is one that requires special discernment by philosophers. That destiny is the full development of all of man's natural capacities, especially man's reason. By man here, Kant did not mean the individual. Nature's goal is a collectivist one, the development of the species. Man's capacities, Kant explained, are, quote, "to be completely developed only in the species, not in the individual," unquote. The individual is merely fodder for nature's goal, as Kant put it in his review of Herder. Quote, "Nature allows us to see nothing else than that it abandons individuals to complete destruction and maintains only the type," unquote. And again in his 1786 speculative beginning of human history, Kant argued that, quote, the path that for the species leads to progress from the worse to the better does not do so for the individual, unquote. The development of the individual is in conflict with the development of the species, and only the development of the species counts. But it is also not the case that the species development is about happiness or fulfillment. Quote, nature is utterly unconcerned that man live well, unquote. The individual and even all existing individuals collectively now living are merely a stage in a process, and their suffering is of no account in the light of nature's ultimate end. In fact, Kant argued, man should suffer, and deservedly so. Man is a sinful creature, a creature that is inclined to follow its own desires and not the demands of duty. Echoing Rousseau, Kant blamed mankind for having chosen to use reason when our instincts could have served us perfectly well. And now that reason has awakened, it has combined with self-interest to pursue all sorts of unnecessary and depraved desires. Thus, the source of our vaunted freedom, Kant wrote, is also our original sin. Quote, the history of freedom begins with badness, for it is man's work, unquote. Accordingly, Kant admonished us, quote, we are a long way from being able to regard ourselves as moral, unquote. Man is a creature made of, quote, warped wood, unquote. Powerful forces are therefore needed in order to attempt to straighten our warped natures. One of those forces is morality, a morality of strict and uncompromising duty that opposes man's animal inclinations. A moral life is one that no rational person would, quote, wish that it should be any longer than it actually is, unquote. But one has a duty to live and develop oneself and thereby the species. Inculcating this morality in man is one of nature's forces. Another force to straighten the warped wood is political. Man is, quote, an animal that, if he lives among other members of his species, has need of a master, unquote. And that is because, quote, his selfish animal propensities induce him to exempt himself from moral rules whenever he can, unquote. Kant then introduced his version of Rousseau's general will. Politically, man, quote, thus requires a master who will break his self-will and force him to obey a universally valid will, unquote. However, strict moral duty and political masters are not enough. Nature has devised an additional strategy for bringing the species man to higher development. That strategy is war. As Kant wrote in his Idea for a Universal History, quote, the means that nature uses to bring about the development of all of man's capacities is the antagonism among them in society, unquote. Thus, conflict, antagonism, and war are good. They destroy many lives, but they are nature's way of bringing forth the higher development of man's capacities. Quote, at the state of culture at which the human race still stands, Kant stated bluntly in Speculative Beginning, war is an indispensable means for bringing it to a still higher stage, unquote. Peace would be a moral disaster, so we are duty-bound not to shrink from war. Out of this self-sacrifice of individuals and the war of nations, Kant hoped, the species would become fully developed, and an international and cosmopolitan federation of states would live peacefully and harmoniously, making possible within themselves the complete moral development of their members. Then, as Kant concluded in a 1794 essay entitled The End of All Things, men would finally be in a position to prepare themselves for the day of, quote, judgment of forgiveness or damnation by the judge of the world, unquote. This is the hidden plan of nature. It is destined to happen, so we know what we have to look forward to. Herder on multicultural relativism. Johann Herder believed that our future will not be so cheerer. Sometimes called the German Rousseau, Herder had studied philosophy and theology at Königsberg University. Kant was his professor of philosophy, and while at Königsberg, Herder also became a disciple of Johann Hamann. Herder is Kantian in his disdain for the intellect, though unlike the static and rigid Kant, he adds a Hamannian, activist, and emotionalist component. Quote, "I am not here to think," Herder wrote, "but to be, feel, live." Unquote. Herder's distinctiveness lies not in his epistemology, but in his analysis of history and the destiny of humankind. What meaning, he asks, can we discern in history? Is there a plan, or is it merely a random happening of chance events? There is a plan. History, Herder argues, is moved by a necessary dynamic development that pushes man progressively toward victory over nature. This necessary development culminates in the achievements of science, arts, and freedom. So far, Herder is not original. Christianity held that God's plan for the world gives a necessary dynamic to the development of history, that history is going somewhere. And the Enlightenment thinkers projected the victory of civilization over the brutish forces of nature. But the Enlightenment thinkers had posited a universal human nature, and they had held that human reason could develop equally in all cultures. From this they inferred that all cultures eventually could achieve the same degree of progress, and that when that happened, humans would eliminate all of the irrational superstitions and prejudices that had driven them apart, and that mankind would then achieve a cosmopolitan and peaceful liberal social order. Not so, says Herder. Instead, each folk is a unique, quote, family writ large, unquote. Each possesses a distinctive culture and is itself an organic community stretching backward and forward in time. Each has its own genius, its own special traits, and necessarily these cultures are opposed to each other. As each fulfills its own destiny, its unique developmental path will conflict with other cultures' developmental paths. Is this conflict wrong or bad? No. According to Herder, one cannot make such judgments. Judgments of good and bad are defined culturally and internally, in terms of each culture's own goals and aspirations. Each culture's standards originate and develop from its particular needs and circumstances, not from a universal set of principles. So, Herder concluded, quote, "Let us have no more generalizations about improvement," unquote. Herder thus insisted, quote, "on a strictly relativist interpretation of progress and human perfectibility," unquote. Accordingly, each culture can be judged only by its own internal standards. One cannot judge one culture from the perspective of another. One can only sympathetically immerse oneself in the other's cultural manifestations and judge them on their own terms. However, according to Herder, attempting to understand other cultures is not really a good idea. And attempting to incorporate other cultures' elements into one's own leads to the decay of one's own culture. Quote, "The moment men start dwelling in wishful dreams of foreign lands from whence they seek hope and salvation, they reveal the first symptoms of disease, of flatulence, of unhealthy opulence, of approaching death," unquote. To be vigorous, creative, and alive, Herder argued, one must avoid mixing one's own culture with those of others, and instead steep oneself in one's own culture and absorb it into oneself. For the Germans, accordingly, given their cultural traditions, attempting to graft Enlightenment branches onto German stock has been and would always be a disaster. Quote, "Voltaire's philosophy has spread, but mainly to the detriment of the world," unquote. The German is not suited for sophistication, liberalism, science, and so on, and so the German should stick to his local traditions, language, and sentiments. For the German, low culture is better than high culture. Being unspoiled by books and learning is best. Scientific knowledge is artificial. Instead, Germans should be natural and rooted in the soil. For the German, the parable of the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden is true. Don't eat of that tree. Live. Don't think. Don't analyze. Herder did not argue that the German way is the best and that it is justifiable for the Germans to become imperialistic and impose their culture upon others. That step was taken by his followers. He argued simply as a German in favor of the German people and urged them to go their own way as opposed to following the Enlightenment. Herder is relevant because of his enormous influence on the nationalist movements that were shortly to take off all over Central and Eastern Europe. He is also relevant to understanding how far from Enlightenment thinking the German Counter-Enlightenment was. If Kant is partially attracted to Enlightenment themes, Herder rejects those elements of Kant's philosophy. While Herder is broadly Kantian, epistemologically, he rejects Kant's universalism. For Herder, how reason shapes and structures is culturally relative. And in contrast to Kant's vision of an ultimately peaceful, cosmopolitan future, Herder projects a future of multicultural conflict. Thus, in the context of German intellectual debates, one was offered a choice: Kant at the semi-Enlightenment end of the spectrum, and Herder at the other. Fichte on education as socialization. Johann Fichte was a disciple of Kant's. Born in 1762, he studied theology and philosophy at Jena, Wittenberg, and Leipzig. In 1788, he read Kant's Critique of Practical Reasoning, and that reading changed Fichte's life. He traveled to Königsberg in order to meet Kant, then the ruling philosopher of Germany. But the great man was initially distant, so Fichte worked as a tutor at Königsberg while working on his moral treatise, Critique of All Revelation. When it was finished, Fichte dedicated it to Kant. Kant read it, admired it, and urged that it be published. It was published anonymously in 1792, and this made Fichte famous in intellectual circles. It was so Kantian in style and content that it was taken by many to have been written by Kant himself, and to be his fourth critique. Kant disclaimed authorship, but praised the young author, thus launching Fichte's academic career. The major breakthrough, however, the event that launched Fichte permanently onto the German landscape as not only a leading philosopher but also as a cultural leader, came in 1807. A year after Napoleon's defeat of the Prussians, Fichte stepped onto the public stage and delivered his ringing call to arms, his Addresses to the German Nation. In the addresses, Fichte spoke as a philosopher who had descended from abstractions to connect with practical affairs, in order to situate those practical affairs within the context of the most metaphysical. He addressed the defeated Germans, calling for a renewal of their spirit and character. The Germans had lost the physical battle, Fichte argued, but now more was at stake. The real battle now was a battle of character. Why had Germany come under the dominion of Napoleon? Fichte granted that many factors were responsible, most of them having to do with the infiltration of softening Enlightenment beliefs. Quote, "All the evils which have now brought us to ruin are of foreign origin," unquote, and that many reforms were needed in the military, religion, and the administration of government. But the fundamental problem was clear. The educational system had failed Germany. Only with a total revision of the method of educating children could Germany hope to become immune from the Napoleons of the future. Quote, "In a word, it is a total change of the existing system of education that I propose as the sole means of preserving the existence of the German nation," unquote. In Fichte's educational philosophy, themes from Rousseau, Hegel, Kant, and Schleiermacher are integrated into a package that would be influential for more than 100 years. In the addresses, there is no question in Fichte's mind about which abstract system is the right one. With Kant, quote, "The problem has been completely solved among us, and philosophy has been perfected," unquote. But Kant's philosophy had not yet been applied systematically to the education of children. Fichte started by looking back to see how Germany got into its current sorry state. Germany used to be great. In the Middle Ages, quote, "the German burghers were the civilized people," unquote, and, quote, "this period is the only one in German history in which this nation is famous and brilliant," unquote. What was great about the burghers was their, quote, "spirit of piety, of honor, of modesty, and of the sense of community," unquote. They were great because they were not individualistic. Quote, "Seldom does the name of an individual stand out or distinguish itself, for they were all of like mind and alike in sacrifice for the common weal," unquote. Fichte was, however, not a conservative apologist for the good old days. In the context of feudal Germany, Fichte was a reformer who believed that it was the corrupt upper classes that had ruined Germany. Quote, "Its bloom was destroyed by the avarice and tyranny of princes," unquote. The Germans had become further corrupted by the modern world, which led to their impotence in the face of Napoleon. What about the modern world essentially caused the corruption? Self-seeking. Quote, "Self-seeking has destroyed itself by its own complete development, and a people can be completely corrupted, that is self-seeking, for self-seeking is the root of all other corruption," unquote. And this, echoing Rousseau, was because men became rational under the guise of enlightenment. This undermined religion and its moral force. Quote, "The enlightenment of the understanding, with its purely material calculations, was the force which destroyed the connection established by religion between some future life and the present," unquote. Consequently, governments became liberal and morally lax. Quote, "The weakness of governments frequently allowed neglect of duty to go unpunished," unquote. So now the German has sold his soul, lost his true self, his identity. Quote, "It follows then that the means of salvation which I promise to indicate consists in the fashioning of an entirely new self, which may have existed perhaps before in individuals as an exception, but never as a universal and national self, and in the education of the nation," unquote. Echoing Rousseau again, quote, "By means of the new education, we want to mold the Germans into a corporate body which shall be stimulated and animated in all its individual members by the same interest," unquote. To start with, education must be egalitarian and universal, unlike previous education, which was feudal and elitist. Quote, "So there is nothing left for us but just to apply the new system to every German without exception, so that it is not the education of a single class, but the education of the nation," unquote. Such education will aid in the creation of a classless society. Quote, "All distinctions of classes will be completely removed and vanish. In this way there will grow up among us not popular education, but real German national education," unquote. Real education must start by getting to the source of human nature. Education must exert, quote, "an influence penetrating to the roots of vital impulse and action," unquote. Here was a great failing of traditional education, for it had relied upon and appealed to the student's free will. Quote, "I should reply that very recognition of and reliance upon free will in the pupil is the first mistake of the old system," unquote. Compulsion, not freedom, is best for students. Quote, "On the other hand, the new education must consist essentially in this, that it completely destroys freedom of the will in the soil which it undertakes to cultivate, and produces on the contrary strict necessity in the decisions of the will, the opposite being impossible. Such a will can henceforth be relied upon with confidence and certainty," unquote. Unfortunately, it is difficult to accomplish this under contemporary living arrangements, in which children go to school and then return to corrupting influences in their homes and their neighborhoods at the end of the day. Quote, "It is essential," Fichte then urged, "that from the very beginning the pupil should be continuously and completely under the influence of this education, and should be separated altogether from the community and kept from all contact with it," unquote. Once the children are separated, educators can then turn their attention to internal matters. In his essay on education, Kant had, of course, argued that, quote, "above all things, obedience is an essential feature in the character of a child, especially of a schoolboy or girl," unquote. However, Fichte pointed out, children are children, and as such they do not naturally impose duties upon themselves. So the school's authorities must firmly impose the duties upon them. Quote, "The legislation should consequently maintain a high standard of severity, and should prohibit the doing of many things. Such prohibitions, which simply must exist, and on which the existence of the community depends, are to be enforced in the case of necessity by fear of immediate punishment, and this penal law must be administered absolutely without indulgence or exception," unquote. One of the duties to be inculcated is the obligation of the student who is more able to help the more needy students. Yet, quote, he is to expect neither reward for it, for under this system of government all are quite equal in regard to work and pleasure, nor even praise, for the attitude of mind prevailing in the community is that it is just everyone's duty to act thus, unquote. Anticipating Marx, Fichte believed that the school should be a microcosm of what the ideal society would be like. Quote, under this system of government, therefore, the acquirement of greater skill and the effort spent therein will result only in fresh work and effort, and it will be the very able pupil who is abler than the rest, who must often watch while the others sleep and reflect while the others play, unquote. More broadly, the new education will eliminate all self-interest and inculcate the pure love of duty for its own sake that Rousseau and Kant had prized. Quote, in place of that love of self, with which nothing for our good can be connected any longer, we must set up and establish in the hearts of all those whom we wish to reckon among our nation that other kind of love, which is concerned directly with the good, simply as such, and for its own sake, unquote. If the system is successful, its fruit will be as follows, quote, its pupil goes forth at the proper time as a fixed and unchangeable machine, unquote. But this moral education is not enough. Drawing upon Hamann and Schleiermacher, Fichte next turned to religion. Quote, the pupil of this education is not merely a member of human society here on this earth and for the short span of life which is permitted to him. He is also, and is undoubtedly acknowledged by education to be, a link in the eternal chain of spiritual life in a higher social order. A training which has undertaken to include the whole of his being should undoubtedly lead him to a knowledge of this higher order also, unquote. Despite being seen as soft on religion by the Lutheran orthodoxy, Fichte argued that education must also be intensely religious. Quote, under proper guidance, the student will find at the end that nothing really exists but life, the spiritual life which lives in thought, and that everything else does not really exist, but only appears to exist, unquote. He will find that, quote, only in immediate contact with God and the direct emanation of his life from him will he find life, light, and happiness. But in any separation from that immediate contact, death, darkness, and misery. Education to true religion is, therefore, the final task of the new education, unquote. So far, Fichte's program of education includes the communal separation of children, severe authoritarian top-down training, strict moral duty and selflessness, and total religious immersion. Not quite the Enlightenment model of liberal education. But Fichte's program did not end there, for now we add the importance of ethnicity. Only the German is capable of true education. The German is the best that the world has to offer and is the hope for the future progress of mankind. Quote, the German alone, above all other European nations, has the capacity of responding to such an education, unquote. But as goes Germany, so goes the rest of Europe and, ultimately, all of humankind. Either the Germans will respond to Fichte's call and reform themselves, or they will sink into oblivion. Quote, but as Germany sinks, the rest of Europe is seen to sink with it, unquote. Thus Fichte, with his passionate style and force of personality, spurred the Germans to action. The Germans listened admiringly and with approval. In 1810, 3 years after the delivery of his addresses, Fichte was appointed dean of the philosophy faculty at the newly founded University of Berlin. Schleiermacher was appointed head of the Faculty of Theology. In the following year, Fichte became rector of the whole university, and so was in a position to put his educational program into practice. Nor was Fichte a flash in the pan. One spark appears over a century later, in 1919, in Friedrich Ebert's speech at the opening of the National Assembly at Weimar. Germany had once again been defeated by foreign powers, and the nation was demoralized, resentful, and starting over. Elected first president of the German Republic in 1919, Ebert made a point in his opening address of stressing the relevance of Fichte to Germany's situation. Quote, "In this way we will set to work our great aim before us, to maintain the right of the German nation, to lay the foundation in Germany for a strong democracy, and to bring it to achievement with the true social spirit and in the socialistic way. Thus shall we realize that which Fichte has given to the German nation as its task." Unquote. Hegel on worshipping the state. While a student at Tübingen, Hegel's favorite reading had been Rousseau. Quote, "The principle of freedom dawned on the world in Rousseau and gave infinite strength to man." Unquote. As discussed in Chapter 2, Hegel was also deeply engaged with the latest developments of Kantian and Fichtean metaphysics and epistemology and their implications for social and political thought. The political battle lines were clearly drawn for Hegel. If Rousseau's account of human freedom is the correct one, then the Enlightenment account of freedom must be a fraud. Disappointed by the outcome of the revolution in France, where it seemed like the Rousseauians had lost their world historical chance, Hegel also had nothing but disdain for England, then arguably the most developed nation of the Enlightenment. Quote, "Of institutions characterized by real freedom, there are nowhere fewer than in England." Unquote. The so-called liberalism of the so-called Enlightenment nations actually represented an, quote, "incredible deficiency," unquote, of rights and freedom. Only by updating the Rousseauian model dialectically and applying it to the German context could we find, quote, "real freedom," unquote. So, what is real freedom to Hegel? Quote, "It must further be understood that all the worth which the human being possesses, all spiritual reality, he possesses only through the state." Unquote. In the broader context of Hegel's philosophy, human history is governed by the necessary working out of the absolute. The absolute, or God, or universal reason, or the divine idea, is the actual substance of the universe, and its developmental processes are everything that is. Quote, "God governs the world. The actual working of his government, the carrying out of his plan, is the history of the world." Unquote. The state, to the extent that it participates in the absolute, is God's instrument for achieving his purposes. Quote, "The state, accordingly, is the divine idea as it exists on earth." Unquote. Given that the individual's ultimate purpose in life should be to achieve union with ultimate reality, it follows that the, quote, "state in and by itself is the ethical whole, the actualization of freedom." Unquote. The consequence of this, morally, is that the individual is of less significance than the state. The individual's empirical, day-to-day interests are of a lower moral order than the state's universal world historical interests. The state has as its final end the self-realization of the absolute, and, quote, "this final end has the supreme right against the individual, whose supreme duty is to be a member of the state." Unquote. Duty, as we have learned from Kant and Fichte, always trumps personal interests and inclinations. Yet mere membership as a matter of duty is not enough for Hegel, given the grandeur of the state's divine historical purpose. Quote, "One must worship the state as a terrestrial divinity." Unquote. In such worship, Hegel believed, we find our real freedom. In such worship, Hegel believed, we find our real freedom. For ultimately, we individuals are but aspects of the absolute spirit, and in so relating to it, we are relating to ourselves. Quote, "For law is the objectivity of spirit, volition in its true form. Only that will which obeys laws is free, for it obeys itself. It is independent and so free." Unquote. Freedom is thus the individual's absolute submission to and worship of the state. There is, of course, the problem of explaining all of this to the average individual. The average individual, in the course of living day-to-day life, often finds that the laws and other manifestations of the state do not seem like real freedom. In most cases, Hegel stated, that is because the average person is ignorant of what true freedom is, and no amount of explaining the higher dialectic to that person will make the laws seem like less of an infringement upon freedom. Yet it is also true, Hegel granted, that in many cases the individual's freedoms and interests will genuinely be set aside, overridden, and even smashed. One reason for this is that the state's general principles are universal and necessary, and so they cannot be expected to apply perfectly to the particular and contingent. As Hegel explained, quote, "Universal law is not designed for the units of the mass. These as such may in fact find that their interests decidedly are thrust into the background." Unquote. But the problem is not merely one of applying the universal to the particular. Individuals must recognize that from the moral perspective, they are not ends in themselves. They are tools for the achievement of higher goals. Quote, "But though we might tolerate the idea that individuals, their desires, and the gratification of them are thus sacrificed, and their happiness given up to the empire of chance to which it belongs, and that as a general rule, individuals come under the category of means to an ulterior end." Unquote. And again, just in case we have missed Hegel's point, quote, "A single person, I need hardly say, is something subordinate, and as such he must dedicate himself to the ethical whole." Unquote. And again, echoing Rousseau, quote, "Hence, if the state claims life, the individual must surrender it." Unquote. Individual life is surrendered rather a lot when very special human beings come along to really shake things up and move God's plan for the world forward. Quote, "World historical individuals," unquote, as Hegel called them, are those who, usually without knowing so themselves, are agents of the absolute's development. Such individuals are energetic and focused, and they are able to amass power and direct social forces in such a way as to achieve something of historical significance. Their achievements, however, exact a high human cost. Quote, "A world historical individual is not so unwise as to indulge a variety of wishes to divide his regards. He is devoted to the one aim, regardless of all else. It is even possible that such men may treat other great, even sacred interests inconsiderately, conduct which is indeed obnoxious to moral reprehension. But so mighty a form must trample down many an innocent flower, crush to pieces many an object in its path." Unquote. The innocent flowers should not object to their destruction. The world historical individual is acting for the best interests of the whole. In that special individual, the state is embodied, and the state is the future of the collective. Even while being destroyed, the innocent flower has worth only through, and so should glory in, his participation in that larger future. Anticipating Nietzsche, Hegel argued that neither should the innocent flowers raise merely moral objections against the activities of the world historical individuals. Quote, "For the history of the world occupies a higher ground than that on which morality has properly its position." Unquote. The needs of historical development are of higher standing than those of morality, and so, quote, "the conscience of individuals," unquote, should not be an obstacle to the achievement of historical destinies. The trampling of morality is regrettable, but, quote, "looked at from this point, moral claims that are irrelevant must not be brought into collision with world historical deeds and their accomplishment." Unquote. From Hegel to the 20th century. One of Auguste Comte's students studied for a while in Germany and attended Hegel's lectures. Reporting back to Comte about how Hegel's doctrines compared to Comte's socialist ones, the student wrote excitedly that, quote, "the identity of results exists even in the practical principles, as Hegel is a defender of the governments, that is to say, an enemy of the liberals," unquote. In the 19th century, the question of the true meaning of socialism was a live issue among collectivists of all stripes. Kant, Herder, Fichte, and Hegel were dominant mainstream voices. Yet clearly none was a conservative. Conservatives of the 19th century favored returning to or reinvigorating feudal institutions. Our four figures, by contrast, all favored significant reforms and a jettisoning of traditional feudalism. Yet none was an Enlightenment liberal. Enlightenment liberals were individualistic, the center of their political and economic gravity tending toward limited governments and free markets. Our four figures, by contrast, voiced themes of strong collectivism in ethics and politics, with calls for individuals to sacrifice for society, whether society was defined as the species, the ethnic group, or the state. We find in the case of Kant a call for individuals to be willing to do their duty to sacrifice for the species. We find in the case of Herder a call for individuals to find their identity in their ethnicity. We find in the case of Fichte a call for education to be a process of total socialization. And we find in the case of Hegel a call for total government to which the individual will surrender everything. For a school of thinkers who advocated total socialization, socialism seemed an appropriate label. Accordingly, many thinkers on the collectivist right thought of themselves as true socialists. Yet socialism was also being used as a label for left collectivists, so there was a lively debate between the left and many on the right over who had the most right to call themselves socialist. The debate was not merely semantics. Both right and left were anti-individualist. Both advocated government management of the most important aspects of society. Both divided human society into groups, which they took to be fundamental to individuals' identities. Both pitted those groups against each other in inescapable conflict. Both favored war and violent revolution to bring about the ideal society. And both sides hated the liberals. Right versus left collectivism in the 20th century. The great events of the early 20th century served as intellectual touchstones in the battle between the left and the right for the soul of the socialist. World War I pitted East against West in the century's first great conflict of incompatible social systems. Leading German intellectuals on the political right were clear about what they took the onset of the war to signify. The war would destroy the decadent liberal spirit, the bland spirit of shopkeepers and traders, and make the way for the ascent of social idealism. Johann Plenge, for example, was one of the outstanding authorities on both Hegel and Marx, was also a man of the political right. His landmark book, Hegel and Marx, reintroduced scholars to the importance of understanding Hegel to understanding Marx. For Plenge, liberalism was a corrupt system, and so socialism had to become the social system of the future. Plenge also believed that socialism would come first to Germany. Quote, "Because in the sphere of ideas, Germany was the most convinced exponent of all socialist dreams, and in the sphere of reality, she was the most powerful architect of the most highly organized economic system. In us is the 20th century." Unquote. The Great War, accordingly, was to be celebrated as the catalyst for bringing that future into existence. The war economy that had been created in 1914 in Germany, wrote Plenge, quote, "is the first realization of a socialist society, and its spirit the first active, and not merely demanding, appearance of the socialist spirit. The needs of the war have established the socialist idea in German economic life." Unquote. Thus, Germany's defeat in World War I was devastating to the collectivist right. Müller-Vandenbroek, unquestionably a man of the German right and an implacable foe of Marxism, summarized the defeat thus, quote, "We have lost the war against the West. Socialism has lost it against liberalism." Unquote. The crushing loss of the war and the psychological defeatism that came with it in Germany contributed to the meteoric success of Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West. Spengler was another man of the right. In Decline, written by 1914 but not published until 1918, Spengler offered a pessimistic combination of Herder and Nietzsche, voicing themes of cultural conflict and decline, arguing that the long, slow victory of liberalism in the West was the clearest indication that Western culture was, as all cultures eventually did, slipping into softness, flaccidity, and ultimately insignificance. All of the markers of Western civilization, Spengler argued, from democratic government to capitalism to the developments of technology, were symptoms of decay. Quote, "The frightful form of soulless, purely mechanical capitalism, which attempts to master all activities and stifles every free, independent impulse and all individuality," unquote, had prevailed, and virtually nothing could be done about it. Ludwig Wittgenstein was thunderstruck by his reading of Spengler. Martin Heidegger was moved profoundly. The decline of the West catapulted Spengler into the front ranks of German public intellectuals. Immediately following the success of Decline, Spengler brought forth his Prussianism and Socialism in 1920. Turning from cultural history to political theory, Spengler hoped to wrest the label socialist away from the Marxists, and to demonstrate that socialism required a national and organic focus. Agreeing with the Marxists, Spengler argued that the ideal state required, quote, "the organization of production and communication by the state, everybody to be a servant of the state," unquote. And agreeing with the Marxists and against the soft liberals, Spengler argued that, quote, "socialism means power, power and more power," unquote. But against the Marxists, who were too rationalistic and too enamored of technology, Spengler argued that real socialism would be organic and rooted in the natural rhythms of life. Marxism, he believed, shared responsibility with capitalism for generating the artificial and materialistic world of the West. Quote, "All things organic are dying in the grip of organization," unquote, Spengler wrote later in Man and Technics, echoing Rousseau. Quote, "An artificial world is permeating and poisoning the natural. The civilization itself has become a machine that does or tries to do everything in mechanical fashion. We think only in horsepower now. We cannot look at a waterfall without mentally turning it into electric power. We cannot survey a countryside full of pasturing cattle without thinking of its exploitation as a source of meat supply. We cannot look at the beautiful old handiwork of an unspoiled primitive people without wishing to replace it by a modern technical process," unquote. We cannot recapture our lost connectedness, Spengler believed, so it is too late for socialism. But, like the heroes of old, we should face up to our destiny stoically and with no illusions. Quote, "Optimism is cowardice," unquote. "All that we can do as beings of honor in a world of decline is stick to our duty." Quote, "Our duty is to hold on to the last position, without hope, without rescue, like that Roman soldier whose bones were found in front of a door in Pompeii, who, during the eruption of Vesuvius, died at his post because they forgot to relieve him. That is greatness," unquote. While Spengler was pessimistic, other right thinkers still saw a chance for true socialism. Ernst Jünger, who had been inspired by Spengler, inspired some of those right thinkers. Jünger had been wounded 3 times in the Great War, but he had returned home determined to renew the fight against the decadent West. The war had been a loss, but a loss that could be transcended. "We are," wrote Jünger, quote, "a new generation, a race that has been hardened and inwardly transformed by all the darting flames and sledgehammer blows of the greatest war in history," unquote. Another right thinker who still believed that socialism could come to be was Werner Sombart, best known as an outstanding sociologist and fiery critic of liberal capitalism. A good Marxist for much of his career, Sombart had moved toward the right in the early 20th century. To Sombart, that did not involve abandoning socialism, but rather strengthening it. It was absolutely essential, Sombart argued, quote, "to free socialism from the Marxian system," unquote. Doing so would make it possible to forge a better form of socialism by focusing it nationally and by rejecting the pretense of being able to, quote, prove the necessity of socialism by means of scientific arguments, unquote. Socialism would then regain its, quote, power of creating new ideals and the possibility of intense feeling, unquote. A new nationalistic focus and rejuvenation of socialism's idealistic feelings would, he thought, better enable socialists to combat the true enemy, liberal capitalism. Sombart's next major work, Merchants and Heroes, 1915, continued his attacks on liberal capitalism by contrasting two opposed types of social being, one decadent and the other noble. And Sombart's attack on that primary target continued through 1928 when, agreeing in essence with Spengler and Moeller, he said of the socialist ideal, quote, "This thought is destined to preserve mankind from a danger which is much greater than that of bureaucratization, and that is the danger of succumbing to mammonism, to the profit devil, to material interest-mongering," unquote. Quote, "Liberalism," wrote Moeller, "is the death of nations," unquote. So socialism had to be able to prevail against it. Yet it had to be the correct kind of socialism, and the correct kind of socialism was not Marxist. Marxist internationalism, the right thinkers from Spengler to Sombart to Moeller argued, ended up being a false or illusory version of socialism. There is no universal culture, so there is no universal set of interests, and no universal form that socialism can take. Socialism must be national. It must be rooted in each culture's distinctive historical context. Quote, "Every people has its own socialism," unquote, wrote Moeller, and so, quote, "international socialism does not exist," unquote. And in a remark that was prescient of the coming decade, Moeller wrote in the 1920s, quote, "Socialism begins where Marxism ends. German socialism is called to play a part in the spiritual and intellectual history of mankind by purging itself of every trace of liberalism. This new socialism must be the foundation of Germany's Third Empire," unquote. The rise of National Socialism. Who are the real socialists? The rise of National Socialism to political prominence during the 1920s brought the abstract debate to particular focus, as the National Socialists, the Communists, and the Social Democrats all argued variations on the same themes and competed for the votes of the same constituencies. The Socialist Social Democrats and the Communists had split over whether socialism would be achieved by evolution or revolution. Hard feelings also existed between the two parties over the Spartacist revolt of 1919, in which the Communists had risen up violently against an elected socialist regime. Thus the Social Democrats, in point of theory and in order to attract votes, regularly argued that there was no essential difference between the Communists and the National Socialists. Both favored violence rather than peaceful and democratic procedures. The Communists also returned the favor often, arguing that the Social Democrats and the National Socialists had both in various ways sold out to capitalism. Ernst Thälmann, for example, in a speech to the plenary session of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Germany, argued that the Social Democrats and the National Socialists were ideological twins. The Social Democrats were willing to compromise with other parties and share power with them. Only endless bickering and vacillation could result from that, which would serve only to maintain the capitalist status quo. The National Socialists, of course, were on the political right, so by definition they had to be in the pocket of the capitalists. The National Socialists recognized that they were on the right and that the Social Democrats and the Communists were on the left, but they found little practical difficulty wooing voters away from both parties by emphasizing the socialist elements of National Socialism, and they did not find that the theoretical goals of the three parties were that far apart. Hitler, for example, declared that, quote, "basically, National Socialism and Marxism are the same," unquote. And Joseph Goebbels, who had a PhD in philology and perhaps a better claim to understand the theoretical issues, argued the same point. Goebbels' social thinking had been influenced strongly by Spengler and by his reading of the major left socialists. He represented a strong voice within the National Socialist Party for its economically socialist planks. Goebbels' hatred of capitalism was legendary, as was his hatred of money. Money, he wrote, quote, is the source of all evil. It's as if mammon were the embodiment of the principle of evil in the world. I hate money from the deepest depths of my soul, unquote. Only socialism would oppose the corruption of liberalism and capitalism. Quote, liberalism means I believe in mammon, unquote, wrote Goebbels in his 1929 Michael, a novel that went through 17 editions by 1942. Quote, socialism means I believe in work, unquote. Thus, Goebbels had often been more than willing to make speeches and write conciliatory essays to the communists, asking them to recognize that the National Socialists and Communists' major goals of overthrowing capitalism and achieving socialism were the same, and that the only significant difference between the two was that the Communists believed that socialism could be achieved at the international level, while the National Socialists believed that it could and should occur at the national level. The differences between National Socialism and Communism boiled down to a choice between the dictatorship of the folk and the dictatorship of the proletariat. In this intellectual and cultural context, it is understandable that voters who often favored the Social Democrats in one election would then vote for the Communists or the National Socialists in the next, often switching allegiance again in the next election. It is also understandable in such a context the National Socialists would score their first big successes among the university students. Quote, students in brown shirts and swastika armbands were a normal sight in classes well before 1932, unquote. Raised in an intellectual climate in which Fichte, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Spengler were the dominant voices, National Socialism seemed to many to be a moral ideal, just as it did to many of their professors who had been schooled in the same works. The students of the 1920s and 1930s saw themselves as rebelling against a corrupt system imposed on them by the foreign, liberal capitalist West. They saw themselves as rebelling against their parents' generation, which had failed during the Great War and after. They saw themselves as rebelling against the capitalism that dislocated the worker, that did not give the worker a fair share, and that had caused the Depression. And they saw themselves as idealistically promoting the liberation of the worker and the German spirit. Speaking of the many bright and talented students from the West who went to Germany to study, Friedrich Hayek has remarked, quote, many a university teacher during the 1930s has seen English and American students return from the continent, uncertain whether they were communists or Nazis, and certain only that they hated Western liberal civilization, unquote. Western liberal civilization, however, survived both the Great Depression and World War II, emerging stronger than it had been before. During the war and its aftermath, the National Socialists and the collectivist right were wiped out physically and discredited morally and intellectually. The new battle lines were simplified and starkly clear: liberal capitalism versus left socialism. End of Chapter 4. Explaining Postmodernism, Chapter 5. The Crisis of Socialism. Marxism and Waiting for Godot. First formulated in the mid-19th century, classical Marxist socialism made two related pairs of claims, one pair economic and one pair moral. Economically, it argued that capitalism was driven by a logic of competitive exploitation that would cause its eventual collapse. Socialism's communal form of production, by contrast, would prove to be economically superior. Morally, it argued, capitalism was evil both because of the self-interested motives of those who engaged in capitalist competition and because of the exploitation and alienation that competition caused. Socialism, by contrast, would be based on selfless sacrifice and communal sharing. The initial hopes of Marxist socialists centered on capitalism's internal economic contradictions. The contradictions, they thought, would manifest themselves in increasing class conflict. As the competition for resources heated up, the capitalists' exploitation of the proletariat would necessarily increase. As the exploitation increased, the proletariat would come to realize its alienation and oppression. At some point, the exploited proletariat would decide that it was not going to take it anymore, and revolution would ensue. So the strategy of the Marxist intellectuals was to wait and mount a lookout for signs that capitalism's contradictions were leading logically and inexorably to revolution. They waited a long time. By the early part of the 20th century, after several failed predictions of imminent revolution, not only was it becoming embarrassing to make further predictions, it was beginning to seem that capitalism was developing in a direction opposite to the way that Marxism said it should be developing. 3 failed predictions. Marxism was and is a class analysis, pitting economic classes against each other in a zero-sum competition. In that competition, the stronger parties would win each successive round of competition, forcing the weaker parties into more desperate straits. Successive rounds of capitalist competition would also pit the stronger parties against each other, yielding more winners and losers, until capitalism generated an economic social structure characterized by a few capitalists at the top and in control of the society's economic resources, while the rest of society was pushed into poverty. Even capitalism's nascent middle class would not remain stable, for the logic of zero-sum competition would squeeze a few of the middle class into the top capitalist class and the rest into the proletariat. This class analysis yielded 3 definite predictions. First, it predicted that the proletariat would both increase as a percentage of the population and become poorer. As capitalist competition progressed, more and more people would be forced to sell their labor. And as the supply of those selling their labor increased, the wages they could demand would necessarily decrease. Second, it predicted that the middle class would decrease to a very small percentage of the population. Zero-sum competition means there are winners and losers, and while a few would consistently be winners and thus become rich capitalists, most would lose at some point and be forced into the proletariat. Third, it predicted that the capitalists would also decrease as a percentage of the population. Zero-sum competition also applies to the competition among the capitalists, generating a few consistent winners in control of everything, while the rest would be forced down the economic ladder. Yet that was not how it worked out. By the early 20th century, it seemed that all 3 of the predictions failed to characterize the development of the capitalist countries. The class of manual laborers had both declined as a percentage of the population and become relatively better off. And the middle class had grown substantially, both as a percentage of the population and in wealth, as had the upper class. Marxist socialism thus faced a set of theoretical problems. Why had the predictions not come to pass? Even more pressing was the practical problem of impatience. If the proletarian masses were the material of revolution, why were they not revolting? The exploitation and alienation had to be there, despite surface appearances, and it had to be being felt by capitalism's victims, the proletariat. So what was to be done about the decidedly non-revolutionary working class? After decades of waiting hopefully and pouncing on any sign of worker dissatisfaction and unrest, the plain fact was that the proletariat was not going to revolt any time soon. Consequently, the waiting strategy needed to be rethought. Socialism needs an aristocracy. Many theorists had the same thought. Among the earliest were the Fabians in England, led by Beatrice and Sidney Webb, and given name recognition by George Bernard Shaw. With typical English politeness, the Fabians had decided to abandon all that unpleasant talk of revolution and to pursue socialism by evolution, by meetings, discussions, pamphlets, and voting. Yet the Fabians also decided early to abandon the strategy of waiting for the proletariat to change society from the bottom up. That approach, they argued, requires much too much confidence in the powers of the ordinary working man. As Beatrice Webb put it in her memoirs, quote,
We have little faith in the average sensual man. We do not believe that he can do much more than describe his grievances. We do not think he can prescribe the remedies." Unquote. For both the prescribed remedies and the initiation of measures to enact them, strong leadership by an elite was essential. In Russia, before the revolution of 1917, Lenin had also modified Marxist theory in the same direction in order to make it applicable to the Russian context. Russians certainly had a lot of grievances, but those suffering most were not doing much about them, seeming to accept stolidly that such was their fated lot in life. And it was hard to blame capitalism for their grievances, given that Russia was still a stronghold of feudalism. Lenin did have an explanation for why the proletariat in the capitalist nations of the West were not revolting under their yoke of oppression and alienation. The Western capitalists had cleverly exported that misery to the poorer, undeveloped nations. But that was not going to help matters in Russia. According to classical Marxism, waiting for socialism to come to Russia meant waiting for capitalism to come to Russia, for capitalism then to develop an industrial proletariat, for the proletariat then to achieve a collective class consciousness, and then revolt against the oppressor. That would take a maddeningly long time. So Marx's theory had to be altered. Socialism in Russia could not wait to develop out of mature capitalism. The revolution would have to take Russia directly from feudalism to socialism. But without capitalism's organized proletariat, the transition would require an elite who would, through force of will and political violence, effect a, quote, revolution from above, unquote, and then impose socialism on everyone in a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, unquote. In China, similar conclusions were reached by Mao Zedong in the 1920s. Mao had been inspired by the results of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Russia, Mao then wrote, was now, quote, the #1 civilized country in the world, unquote. But he was also unimpressed with the results of his and the other communists' efforts to educate and organize the Chinese peasantry. So Mao had also decided that socialism would have to arise directly out of feudalism. Compared to Russia, China had even less mass political consciousness. Consequently, Mao believed that while the peasantry had a role to play in making the revolution happen, a strong elite leadership was essential. Mao then introduced two other variations that Lenin did not. The classical Marxist vision of socialism included a developed industrial and technological economy, one that would come about and be maintained by the forces of dialectical logic. Mao de-emphasized technology and rationality. Chinese socialism would be more agrarian and low-tech, and it would be brought about less by logic and reason than by sheer, unpredictable will and assertion. Returning to the European context of the 1920s, the need for strong leadership was confirmed to most radicals by the impotence of the German Social Democrats. Then the leading socialist party in the world and in control of Germany's government for most of the decade, the Social Democrats proved incapable of accomplishing anything. To George Lukács and to Max Horkheimer and the early thinkers of the Frankfurt School, this also pointed up the need for a modification of classical Marxist theory. Left to their own devices, the proletariat and their spokesmen would simply wallow in futility. Not only was the Social Democratic leadership too wishy-washy and compromising, its voting constituencies among the working classes were themselves clueless about their real needs and their real but masked state of oppression. The lesson that the leftist of the left radicals drew was, so much for democracy, so much for the grassroots, bottom-up approach, so much for appealing to the masses and waiting for them to do anything. What socialism needs is leadership that will diagnose capitalism's problems clearly, set remedies, and act decisively and ruthlessly to achieve socialism. Along the way, telling the masses what they needed to hear and what to do and when. Ironically then, by the 1930s, large segments of the radical left had come to agree with what National Socialists and fascists had long argued. that socialism needs an aristocracy. Granted, the far right and now much of the far left agreed socialism must be for the people, but it cannot be by the people. The people must be told what they need and how to get it. And for both, the direction and impetus must come from an elite. Thus, the Soviet Union came to be the great hope for socialism. With Joseph Stalin now running Russia on precisely that elitist model, the Soviet Union seemed the answer to most left socialists' prayers. The failed predictions of classical Marxist socialism could be set aside and forgotten, the appropriate theoretical and practical adjustments had been made, and the future looked bright for socialism. Good news for socialism: depression and war. Almost better than the example of the Soviet Union was the arrival of long-hoped-for economic trouble in the capitalist West. With the coming of the Great Crash in 1929 and the ensuing Depression, it had to be that at long last capitalism's internal contradictions were manifesting themselves. Utilized productive capacity plunged. Unemployment skyrocketed. Tension among the classes increased dramatically. And as the months stretched into years, no recovery was in sight. All socialists were quick to see the Depression as a great opportunity. Surely anyone could see that this must be the end of the road for liberal capitalism. Even the less perspicacious working classes, especially since they were bearing the brunt of the pain, had to be able to see that. All that the socialists had to do was to get their act together and, led by an intransigent cadre of leaders, give tottering capitalism the shove it needed to topple it into the dustbin of history. It did not work out that way for the left socialists. In both Germany and Italy, the National Socialists proved better at using the Depression to their advantage, somehow continuing to delude the proletariat about their real needs and stealing votes from the left socialists. As the world headed into war in the late 1930s, even the onset of hostilities brought hope to the left. The war effort on the part of the liberal capitalist nations had to be their last desperate hope to salvage something. There's also the strong possibility that if the war lasted, the liberals and National Socialists would kill each other off, or at the very least seriously weaken each other, leaving the field open for left socialism, under the leadership of the Soviet Union, to sweep the world. Again, it did not work out that way. The war wrought enormous destruction on both sides, but the pickings were slim for the left socialists. Physically and psychologically, Germany was devastated at the end of the war. Ideologically, the collectivist right was defeated, demoralized, and appropriately demonized. But in the West, in spite of their losses and war weariness, the liberal capitalist nations were physically mobilized and psychologically jubilant. The capitalist nations made the transition from war to peace relatively smoothly, and they saw their victory as not only a physical but a moral triumph for liberalism, democracy, and capitalism. From the perspective of the left, then, the defeat of the collectivist right was a mixed blessing. A hated enemy was gone, but the left was alone in the field against a victorious and vigorous liberal capitalist West. Bad news. Liberal capitalism rebounds. By the 1950s, the liberal nations had, damnably, recovered from the Depression and the war and were, even worse, flourishing under capitalism. That was extremely disappointing to the left, but it was not necessarily hopeless. Lenin's theory of imperialism had explained that the effects of capitalist exploitation would not be found in the powerful and rich nations, since those nations simply exported those costs to the poorer and weaker developing nations. So perhaps hope for revolution could be found in the developing capitalist nations. But over time, that hope fizzled. The exported oppression was not to be found in those nations either. Nations that adopted capitalism in varying degrees were not suffering from their trade with the richer nations. Instead, the trade was mutually beneficial, and from humble beginnings, those nations that adopted capitalist measures rose first to comfort and then to wealth. Just as a teenager typically starts working at low-tech, labor-intensive, low-paying jobs, and then acquires skills and so is promoted to positions that are higher-tech, information-intensive, and higher-paying, the developing capitalist nations followed the same pattern. And in the most developed nations, overall wealth was rising and poverty was decreasing yet further. What were once luxuries were becoming standard fare, and the working classes were enjoying stable employment, their television sets, the latest fashions, and their vacations across the country in their new cars. In the 1950s, accordingly, the radical left turned its attention and hopes even more strongly to the Soviet Union, looking for it to outstrip the capitalist West in being both an exemplar of moral idealism and a paragon of economic production. Those hopes were soon to be dashed cruelly. While the economic data were mixed and the propaganda was heavy, the Soviet Union was experiencing chronic difficulties in providing basic consumer items and feeding its people. Some productive successes had been achieved by directing vast amounts of resources to the military and heavy industries. Yet in providing for its people's basic needs, the Soviet Union was not only not progressing, in many areas its production had declined to levels below those of the pre-1917, pre-communist revolution era. In the 1950s, contemporary data from both Soviet and American sources painted much the same picture. Data were sparse and subject to blinkered interpretations, but by the mid-1950s, a decade after the end of the war, the bloom was off the red rose of hope for even the most ardent of the Soviet fellow travelers. The rose was crushed in 1956. Worse news: Khrushchev's revelations and Hungary. Socialists have generally been willing to grant that possibly, just possibly, capitalist economic production would outstrip socialist production. But no socialist has ever been willing to grant that capitalism can hold a candle to socialism morally. Socialism is driven more than anything else by an ethic of altruism, by a conviction that morality is about selflessness, being willing to put others' needs before one's own, and, when necessary, being willing to sacrifice oneself for others, especially those others who are weaker and needier. Thus, to a socialist, any socialist nation has to be morally superior to any capitalist nation. Socialist leaders are by definition concerned primarily about the needs of their citizens and are sensitively responsive to their expressions of concern, their grievances, and, where there are troubles, to their plights. The year 1956 dealt two blows to that faith. The second blow came late in the year, in October, with the bloody suppression of a revolt in the Soviet satellite state of Hungary. Strong dissatisfaction with chronic economic troubles and with being under the thumb of Moscow led to demonstrations and outbreaks of physical resistance to authority by Hungarian workers, students, and others. The Soviet response was swift and brutal. The tanks and the troops were sent in, demonstrators and their organizers were killed and executed, and the revolt was suppressed. The lesson to the Hungarians was administered before a worldwide audience. Dissent is not allowed. Shut up, put up with it, and obey. The first blow, however, delivered in February of 1956, was the one that had the most devastating impact on the future of left socialism. In a secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev made a sensational revelation of the crimes of Stalin's era. In the name of the future of socialism, Stalin had had millions of his own citizens tortured, subjected to inhuman deprivations, executed, or sent to die in Siberian labor camps. What had been dismissed as capitalist propaganda was now revealed as true by the leader of the socialist world. The flagship socialist nation was guilty of horrors on an unimaginable scale. Khrushchev's shocking revelations caused a moral crisis among the socialist left. Could it be true? Or, hopefully, could it be that Khrushchev was exaggerating or lying to score political points? Or, more sinisterly, had the leader of the socialist world become a stooge for the CIA, that sneaky agent of capitalist imperialism? But, if Khrushchev's revelations were even partially true, then how could such horrors have happened under socialism? Is it possible that there is some flaw in socialism itself? No, of course not. And then, of course, what about those gloating capitalists, hatefully saying, "I told you so"? Schisms developed immediately within far-left circles over the proper response to the revelations. Was the Soviet Union not the socialist ideal? Or was Khrushchev a betrayer of the cause? Some extreme true believers took the position that Khrushchev was a traitor, and that in any case anything that Stalin had done was no reflection upon socialism. That line became harder to maintain as time went on and more revelations about life in the Soviet Union came forth, confirming in gritty detail what Khrushchev had said. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, first published in the West in 1973, was the most widely read and condemnatory. Solzhenitsyn's book drew upon extensive research and Solzhenitsyn's own first-hand experience of 8 years imprisonment in the labor camps for the crime of having written in 1945 a letter critical of Stalin's regime. As it became impossible to believe in the morality of the Soviet Union, a shrinking contingent of true believers shifted their devotions, first to communist China under Mao. But then came revelations of even worse horrors in China in the 1960s, including 30 million deaths between 1959 and 1961. Then Cuba was the great hope, and then Vietnam, then Cambodia, then Albania for a while in the late 1970s, and then Nicaragua in the 1980s. But the data and the disappointments piled up, all dealing a solid and devastating blow to socialism's ability to claim a moral sanction. One such set of summary data is reproduced below in the form of a table comparing liberal democratic, authoritarian, and totalitarian governments in terms of one measure of morality, the number of their own citizens those governments have killed. Deaths from democide compared to deaths from international war, 1900 to 1987. Killed by own government. Democratic nations, 2 million people. Authoritarian nations, 29 million people. Totalitarian nations, 138 million people. Communist governments account for 110 million of the deaths in the totalitarian category. Killed by international war. Democratic nations, 4.4 million. Authoritarian nations, 15.3 million. Totalitarian nations, 14.4 million. Included in the totalitarian killed by own government cell are the 10 to 12 million human beings killed by the German National Socialists in the period 1933 to 1945. Subtracting that number from 138 million, along with subtracting a few million killed by miscellaneous totalitarian regimes, means that over 110 million human beings were killed by the governments of nations inspired by left, primarily Marxist socialism. The true believers aside, few far-left socialists waited until after the 1950s to see what further damning data would come forth. In France, for example, most French intellectuals had joined the Communist Party in the 1950s, including Michel Foucault, or had become at least very strong sympathizers, as did Jacques Derrida. Foucault became dissatisfied with the self-stultification that party membership required. Quote, being obliged to stand behind a fact that was totally beyond credibility was part of that exercise of the dissolution of the self, of the quest for a way to be other, unquote. And so, as Derrida reports, many began to drift away. Quote, for many of us, a certain, and I emphasize certain, end of communist Marxism did not await the recent collapse of the USSR and everything that depends on it throughout the world. All that started, all that was even déjà vu, indubitably, at the beginning of the 50s, unquote. The crises of the 1950s were enough for most left intellectuals worldwide to recognize that the case for socialism was in serious trouble economically and morally, and they realized that making the case for socialism was being made doubly difficult by the fact that the capitalist countries were doing well economically, and, for the most part, going in the right direction morally. It is hard to argue with prosperity, and it is hard to make stick any qualms one has about capitalism's moral status when confronted with the revelations about the horrible and very real failings of socialism in practice. Some left intellectuals retreated into despair. Quote, "The millennium has been canceled," unquote, wrote socialist historian Edward Hyams, ending on a note of resignation. But for many theoreticians of the far left, the crisis meant only that more radical responses to capitalism were needed. Responding to the crisis, change socialism's ethical standard. What was once a monolithic Marxist left proceeded to split into numerous camps. All of the camps recognized, though, that if the fight against capitalism were to be carried on, the first order of business was to distance socialism from the Soviet Union. Just as the disaster of National Socialism in Germany was not socialism, the disaster of communism in the Soviet Union was not socialism. In fact, there were no real socialist societies anywhere, so pointing fingers of moral condemnation was simply meaningless. With no real socialist states to uphold as positive examples of socialist practice, the left's new strategies focused almost exclusively upon critiquing the liberal capitalist nations. The first major new strategy required altering the ethical standard by which capitalism was attacked. A traditional criticism of capitalism had been that it causes poverty. Except for the very few at the top of the social heap, capitalism drives most people into bare subsistence. Capitalism was therefore immoral, for the basic moral test of a social system is its ability to provide for its people's basic economic needs. The ethical standard used in criticizing capitalism was, accordingly, Marx's slogan in Critique of the Gotha program. Quote, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need," unquote. Satisfying need was thus the fundamental criterion of morality. Yet come the 1950s, it was hard to argue that capitalism fails to satisfy its people's needs. In fact, a big part of the problem seemed to be that capitalism had satisfied its people's needs so well that the people had become fat and complacent and not at all revolutionary. So a moral standard that made satisfying needs primary was now useless in a critique of capitalism. From need to equality. A new ethical standard was therefore necessary. With great fanfare, then, much of the left changed its official ethical standard from need to equality. No longer was the primary criticism of capitalism to be that it failed to satisfy people's needs. The primary criticism was to be that its people did not get an equal share. The German Social Democrats took the lead in developing the new strategy. As the party most directly descended from Marx himself, and still the leading socialist party in the Western world, the Social Democrats made major changes to their basic program at a special party congress at Bad Godesberg in November of 1959. The most significant of the changes emphasized equality. The Godesberg program recast the party from being a party of the defenseless and impoverished worker to being a party of the people at large. Since the workers seemed to be doing well enough under capitalism, the focus had to shift to different capitalist pathologies, the many inequalities across various social dimensions. One dimension singled out for special attention was the unequal sizes of business enterprises. Some businesses are much bigger than others, giving them an unfair advantage over their smaller competitors. So equalizing the competitive playing field became the new goal. No longer would the Social Democrats condemn all private businesses as rapacious and call for their outright socialization. Rather, they would push for cutting bigger businesses down to size and for strengthening small and middle-sized businesses. In other words, achieving equality had supplanted satisfying basic needs as the revised standard by which to evaluate capitalism. A variation on this strategy was implicit in a new definition of poverty that the left began to offer in the early 1960s. The poverty that capitalism causes is not absolute, but relative. Popularized in the United States by Michael Harrington and others, The new argument abandoned the claim that capitalism would generate a physically malnourished and therefore revolutionary proletariat. Capitalism did not cause such absolute poverty. Rather, the proletariat would become revolutionary because while their basic physical needs were being met, they saw that some others in society had relatively much more than they did. Feeling excluded and without real opportunities to achieve the good life the rich were enjoying, the proletariat would experience psychological oppression and thus be driven to desperate measures. Another variation on this strategy emerged as the formerly monolithic Marxist socialist movement splintered in response to the crisis of socialism. Abandoning the traditional economic class analysis's implication that effort should be focused upon achieving a universal class consciousness, left thinkers and activists focused on narrower subdivisions of the human species, concentrating their efforts on the special issues of women and of racial and ethnic minorities. Broadly Marxist themes of conflict and oppression carried over into the new splinter groups analyses, but again the dominant theme was equality. As with the economic proletariat, it was hard to deny that women and racial and ethnic minority groups had made significant gains in the liberal capitalist nations. So again, the criticism of capitalism could not be that it drove those groups to outright poverty or slavery or some other form of oppression. Instead, the criticism focused on the lack of equality between the groups. Not, for example, that women were being forced into poverty, but rather that as a group they had been held back from achieving economic equality with men. Common to all of these variations was a new emphasis on the principle of equality and a de-emphasis on the principle of need. In effect, in changing the ethical standard from need to equality, all of these new varieties of left socialism had resolved to quote Marx less and to quote Rousseau more. From wealth is good to wealth is bad. A second strategic change in left strategy involved a more audacious change of ethical standards. Traditionally, Marxist socialism had supposed that providing adequately for human needs was a basic test of a social system's morality. The achievement of wealth, accordingly, was a good thing, since wealth brought with it better nutrition, housing, health care, and leisure time. And so capitalism was held to be evil because Marxists believed that it denied most of its population the ability to enjoy the fruits of wealth. But as it became clear that capitalism is very good at producing the wealth and delivering the fruits, and that socialism is very bad at it, two new variations on left thought turned this argument on its head and began to condemn capitalism precisely for being so good at producing wealth. One variation of this argument appeared in the increasingly popular writings of Herbert Marcuse. Soon to be the leading philosopher of the New Left, Marcuse was best known for bringing the views of the Frankfurt School to prominence in the English-speaking world, especially in North America. Trained in philosophy in Germany, Marcuse had been an assistant to Heidegger from 1928 to 1933, and in his metaphysics and epistemology, Marcuse was mining the same Hegelian vein that Heidegger was. Politically, though, Marcuse was deeply engaged with Marxism and concerned with adapting Marxism to the unforeseen resilience of capitalism in resisting revolution. Following Marx, Marcuse believed that the historical purpose of the proletariat was to be a revolutionary class. Its task was to overthrow capitalism. But that presupposed that capitalism would drive the proletariat into economic misery, which capitalism had failed to do. Instead, capitalism had produced great amounts of wealth, and, here is the innovation, capitalism had used that wealth to oppress the proletariat. By making the members of the proletariat wealthy enough to become comfortable, capitalism had created a captive class. The proletariat had become locked into the capitalist system, dependent upon its goodies and enslaved by the goal of climbing the economic ladder and to, quote, the aggressive performances of earning a living, unquote. Not only was this a veiled form of oppression, Marcuse argued, the proletariat had become distracted from its historical task by the comforts and gadgets of capitalism. Capitalism's producing so much wealth, therefore, is bad. It is in direct defiance of the moral imperative of historical progress towards socialism. It would be much better if the proletariat were in economic misery under capitalism, for then they would realize their oppression and then be psychologically primed to perform their historical mission. The second variation was seen in the left turn that rising concern with environmental issues took. As the Marxist movement splintered and mutated into new forms, left intellectuals and activists began to look for new ways to attack capitalism. Environmental issues, alongside women's and minorities' issues, came to be seen as a new weapon in the arsenal against capitalism. Traditional environmental philosophy had not been, in principle, in conflict with capitalism. It had held that a clean, sustainable, and beautiful environment was good because living in such an environment made human life healthier, wealthier, and more enjoyable. Human beings, acting to their advantage, change their environments to make them more productive, cleaner, and more attractive. In the short run, there are often costs and trade-offs between economic growth and environmental cleanliness. But the argument ran, in the middle and long run, a healthy economy is compatible with a healthy environment. As human beings become richer, they have more disposable income with which to make their environments cleaner and more beautiful. The new impetus in environmental thinking, however, brought the Marxist concepts of exploitation and alienation to bear upon environmental issues. As the stronger party, humans necessarily exploit harmfully the weaker parties, the other species, and the non-organic environment itself. Consequently, as capitalist society develops, the result of the exploitation is a biological form of alienation. Humans alienate themselves from the environment by despoiling it and making it unlivable, and non-human species are alienated by being driven to extinction. On this analysis, the conflict between economic production and environmental health, then, is not merely in the short run, it is fundamental and inescapable. The production of wealth itself is in mortal conflict with environmental health, and capitalism, since it is so good at producing wealth, must therefore be the environment's number one enemy. Wealth, therefore, was no longer good. Living simply, avoiding producing or consuming as much as possible, was the new ideal. The impetus of this new strategy, captured perfectly in the title of Rudolf Barrow's book, From Red to Green, integrated with the new emphasis on equality over need. In Marxism, humankind's technological mastery of nature was a presupposition of socialism. Marxism was a humanism in the sense of putting human values at the core of its value framework and assuming that the environment is there for human beings to use and enjoy for their own ends. But egalitarian critics began to argue more forcefully, just as males putting their interests highest led them to subjugate women, and just as whites putting their interests highest led them to subjugate all other races, humans putting their interests highest had led to the subjugation of the other species and the environment as a whole. The proposed solution, then, was the radical moral equality of all species. We must recognize not only that productivity and wealth are evil, but that all species, from bacteria to woodlice to aardvarks to humans, are equal in moral value. Quote, deep ecology, unquote, as radical egalitarianism applied to environmental philosophy came to be called, thus rejected the humanistic elements of Marxism and substituted explicitly Heidegger's anti-humanist value framework. In effect, by rejecting high-tech socialism and substituting a vision of low-tech, egalitarian socialism, this new left strategy also resolved to quote Marx less and to quote Rousseau more. Responding to the crisis, change socialism's epistemology. While some on the left modified their ethics, others set to revising Marxist psychology and epistemology. Beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, there had been some early suggestions that Marxism was too rationalistic, too logical and deterministic. In the 1920s, Mao, had urged that will and assertion of the peasants, and especially of the leaders, counted for more than passively waiting for the material conditions of revolution to work themselves out deterministically. In the 1930s, Antonio Gramsci had rejected the belief that the Depression would necessarily spell the doom of capitalism, and he had argued that finishing off capitalism would require the creative initiative of the masses. That creative initiative, Gramsci argued, was, however, neither rational nor inexorable, but rather subjective and unpredictable. And early Frankfurt School theorizing had suggested that Marxism was too wedded to reason, that reason led to major social pathologies, and that less rational psychological forces had to be incorporated into any successful social theory. Those voices were mostly ignored for 2 decades, swept aside by the dominant voices of classical Marxist theory, the Depression and World War II, and by the conviction that the Soviet Union was showing the world the true path. By the 1950s, however, 2 developments began to merge, one epistemological and one political economic. In the world of academic epistemology, both European and Anglo-American theorists were reaching skeptical and pessimistic conclusions about the power of reason. Heidegger was ascendant on the continent, and logical positivism was reaching its dead end in the Anglo-American world. And in both theoretical and practical politics and economics, the failure of Marxism to develop according to the logic of its traditional theory was reaching a crisis. The merging of these 2 developments yield the surging to prominence of non-rational and irrationalist left socialisms. The symptoms were many. One was manifest in the splintering of the monolithic Marxist movement into many sub-movements, emphasizing the socialism of sex, race, and ethnic identity. Such movements abandoned the universalistic conceptions of human interests implicit in seeking a collective consciousness of the international proletariat. The international proletariat is a highly abstract concept. The universality of all human interests is a very sweeping generalization. Both abstraction and generalization require strong confidence in the power of reason, and by the 1950s, that confidence in reason had evaporated. The loss of confidence in reason implied, as a matter of practical politics, that the intellectuals now had even less confidence in the average person's capacity for abstract reasoning. It is hard enough for a trained intellectual to conceive, as classical Marxism requires, of all of humankind as ultimately members of a universal class sharing the same universal interests. But the more epistemologically modest theorists of the 1950s began to ask, can we really expect the masses to abstract to the view that we are all brothers and sisters under the skin? Can the masses conceive of themselves as a harmonious international class? The intellectual capacity of the masses is much more limited. So appealing to and mobilizing the masses requires speaking to them about what matters to them and on a level that they can grasp. What the masses can understand and what they do get fired up about are their sexual, racial, ethnic, and religious identities. Both epistemological modesty and effective communication strategy, then, dictated a move from universalism to multiculturalism. In effect, by the late 1950s and early 1960s, significant portions of the left came to agree with the collectivist right on yet another issue. Forget internationalism, universalism, and cosmopolitanism. Focus on smaller groups formed on the basis of ethnic, racial, or other identities. Another symptom of the rejection of reason was the wild rise in popularity of Mao and China among the younger radicals. Not as committed to the Soviet Union as the older generation of leftists was, many in the younger generation turned enthusiastically to Chinese communism in practice and Maoist Marxism in theory. Mao's Little Red Book was read widely on college campuses and increasingly studied by revolutionaries in training. From it, they absorbed Mao's lessons of making revolution through sheer political and ideological will, of not waiting for material conditions to develop of themselves, of being pragmatic and opportunistic and willing to use ambiguous rhetoric and even cruelty, and above all, of being constantly and militantly activist even to the point of wildness and irrationality. Make the revolution somehow and anyhow. In effect, this strain of left thought came to agree with what the collectivist right had also long argued, that human beings are not fundamentally rational, that in politics it is the irrational passions that must be appealed to and utilized. The lessons of Maoism integrated with the lessons of the preeminent philosopher of the New Left, Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, Marx plus Freud, or oppression plus repression. Marcuse had long labored in the trenches of academic philosophy and social theory before coming to fame in America in the 1960s. He studied philosophy at Freiburg under Husserl and Heidegger, later becoming an assistant to both. His first major publication was an attempt to synthesize Heideggerian phenomenology with Marxism. His powerful allegiance to Marxism, combined with his Heideggerian distrust of Marxism's rationalistic elements, led Marcuse to join forces with the nascent Frankfurt School of social thought. The Frankfurt School was a loose association of mostly German intellectuals centered at the Institute for Social Research, led from 1930 on by Max Horkheimer. Horkheimer had also been trained in philosophy, having completed his doctoral dissertation on the philosophy of Kant in 1923. From that work, Horkheimer moved directly to concerns with social psychology and practical politics. In the late 1920s, while Marcuse was working on his theoretical integration of Marx and Heidegger, Horkheimer was reaching some pessimistic conclusions about the possibility of practical political change. Setting before himself the question of why the German proletariat were not revolting, Horkheimer offered a breakdown of the politically relevant units, arguing that each was incapable of achieving anything significantly. Naturally enough, Horkheimer began his analysis with the working classes, dividing them into the employed and the unemployed. The employed, he noted, are not too badly off and seem content enough. It is the unemployed who are in the worst shape. Their situation is also getting worse, for as the mechanization of production increases, unemployment also increases. But the unemployed are also the least educated class and the least organized, and that has made it impossible to raise their class consciousness. A clear sign of this is that they waver between voting for the communists, who are blindly following Moscow, and the National Socialists, who are, well, a bunch of Nazis. The only other socialist party is the Social Democrats, but they are much too pragmatic and reformist to be effective. So, Horkheimer concluded, the situation is hopeless for socialism. The employed are too comfortable. The unemployed are too scatterbrained. The Social Democrats are too wishy-washy. The communists are too obediently following authority. And the National Socialists are undiscussable. As a way out of the morass, the Frankfurt School's members began to explore the idea of adding a more sophisticated social psychology to Marxism's economic and historical logic. Traditional Marxism had emphasized the inexorable laws of economic development and de-emphasized the contribution of human actors. Given that those Marxist laws seemed rather more exorable in their non-development, the Frankfurt School suggested that history is as much made by human actors, and especially by how those human actors understand themselves psychologically and their existential situation. Incorporating a better social psychology into Marxism would hopefully explain why the revolution had not happened and suggest what would be necessary to make it happen. For sophisticated social psychology, the Frankfurt School turned to Sigmund Freud. Applying his own psychoanalytical theories to social philosophy, Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930, argued that civilization is an unstable, surface phenomenon based upon the repression of instinctual energies. Biopsychologically, human agents are a bundle of aggressive and conflicted instincts, those instincts constantly pressing for immediate satisfaction. Their constant immediate satisfaction, though, would make social living impossible. So the forces of civilization have evolved by incrementally suppressing instincts and forcing their expression into polite, orderly, and rational forms. Civilization is thus an artificial construct overlaying a seething mass of irrational energies in the id. The battle between the id and civilization is ongoing and occasionally brutal. To the extent that the id wins, society tends toward conflict and chaos. And to the extent that society wins, the id is forced into repression. Repression, however, merely forces the id's energies underground psychologically, where those energies are unconsciously displaced and often forced into irrational channels. That displaced energy, Freud explained, must discharge itself eventually, and often it does so by bursting out neurotically, in the form of hysterias, obsessions, and phobias. The task of the psychoanalyst, then, is to trace the neurosis back through its irrational unconscious channels to its origin. Patients, however, often interfere with this process. They resist the exposure of unconscious and irrational elements in their psyches, and they cling to the conscious forms of civilized and rational behavior that they have learned. So the psychoanalyst must find a way to bypass those surface blocking behaviors and to strip away the conscious veneer of civility to probe the seething id below. Here, Freud suggested, the use of non-rational psychological mechanisms becomes essential. Dreams, hypnosis, free association, slips of the tongue. Such manifestations of irrationality are often clues to the underlying reality, for they slip past the patient's conscious defense mechanisms. The well-trained psychoanalyst, accordingly, is the one who is able to spot the truth in the irrational. To the Frankfurt School, Freud offered a psychology admirably suited to diagnosing the pathologies of capitalism. Capitalism, we know from Marx, is definitely based on exploitative competition. But modern capitalist society is taking a technocratic form, directing its conflictual energies toward creating machines and corporate bureaucracies. Those machines and bureaucracies do provide for the average member of the bourgeoisie an artificial world of order, control, and creature comforts. But at a very high cost, capitalism's people are increasingly distant from nature, decreasingly spontaneous and creative, increasingly unaware that they are being controlled by the machines and the bureaucracies, both physically and psychologically, and increasingly unaware that the apparently comfortable world they live in is a mask for an underlying realm of brutal conflict and competition. The Frankfurt School portrait of capitalism, Marcuse explained, is what we find realized most extremely in the most advanced capitalist nation, the United States. Consider Joe Sixpack. Joe works as a low-level technician for a television manufacturing company, part of a huge telecommunications conglomerate. Whether he has a job tomorrow depends on Wall Street speculators and the decisions of a corporate headquarters in another state. But Joe does not realize that. He simply goes to work each morning with a slight sense of distaste, pulls the levers and pushes the buttons as he is told to do by the machine and the boss, mass-producing televisions until it is time to go home. On the way home, he picks up a six-pack of beer, another mass-market product of capitalist commodification, and after supper with the family, he plops down in front of the television, feeling the narcotic effect of the beer kicking in, while the sitcoms and commercials tell him that life is great and who could ask for anything more. Tomorrow is another day. Joe Sixpack is a product. He is a constructed part of an oppressive and dysfunctional competitive system, but one that is overlain with the veneer of peace and comfort. He is unaware of the gap between the appearance of comfort and the reality of oppression, unaware that he is a cog in an artificial technological system, unaware because the fruits of capitalism that he produces and thinks he is enjoying are consuming and sapping his vital instincts and making him physically and psychologically inert. Thus, Marcuse had an explanation for the new generation of revolutionaries in training for why capitalism in the 1950s and early 1960s seemed to be peaceful, tolerant, and progressive when, as every good socialist knew, it could not really be, and for why the workers were so disappointingly unrevolutionary. Capitalism does not merely oppress the masses existentially, it also represses them psychologically. It gets worse, for to the extent that Joe can even think about his situation, he hears his world described in terms of freedom, democracy, progress, words that have only a faint glimmer of meaning to him, and that have been crafted and fed to him by capitalism's apologists to keep him from thinking too deeply about his real existence. Joe is a, quote, one-dimensional man, unquote, trapped in a, quote, totalitarian universe of technological rationality, unquote, oblivious to the second and real dimension of human existence wherein true freedom, democracy, and progress lie. Capitalism's having achieved this cynical state of development in which its oppression is masked by pious hypocrisies about liberty and progress is made even more cynical by its being able to neutralize and even co-opt all dissent and criticism. Having created a monolithic technocracy, the machines and the bureaucracies and the mass man and the self-serving ideology, capitalism can pretend to be open to criticism by allowing some radical intellectuals to dissent in the name of, quote, tolerance, open-mindedness, and free speech. A few lonely voices will be permitted to raise objections and challenges to the capitalist behemoth. But everyone knows full well that nothing will come of the criticisms. Worse still, the appearance of having been open and tolerant will serve only to reinforce capitalism's control. Capitalist tolerance, then, is not real tolerance. It is, quote, repressive tolerance, unquote. So, was Horkheimer's early pessimism right? Was the lesson 30 years later still the same? That the prospect for socialism is totally hopeless? If capitalism's control extends even to co-opting the dissent of its strongest critics, what weapons are left to the revolutionary? If there is a chance for socialism, then more extreme tactics will be necessary. Freudian psychology again gives us the key. As with the repression of the id's energies by the forces of civilization, capitalism's suppression of the original human energies cannot be totally successful. Freud had explained that the id's repressed energies will occasionally burst out in irrational, neurotic forms, threatening the stability and security of civilization. The Frankfurt School taught us that capitalism's orderly technocracy has repressed much of humanity, driving much of its energy underground. But that repressed energy is still there, and potentially it can burst out. Thus, Marcuse concluded, capitalism's repression of human nature may be socialism's salvation. Capitalism's rational technocracy suppresses human nature to the point that it bursts out in irrationalisms, in violence, criminality, racism, and all of society's other pathologies. But by encouraging those irrationalisms, the new revolutionaries can destroy the system. So the first task of the revolutionary is to seek out those individuals and energies on the margins of society, the outcast, the disorderly, and the forbidden, anyone and anything that capitalism's power structure has not yet succeeded in commodifying and dominating totally. All such marginalized and outcast elements will be, quote, irrational, immoral, and even criminal, unquote, especially by capitalist definition, but that is precisely what the revolutionary needs. Any such outcast element could, quote, break through the false consciousness and provide the Archimedean point for a larger emancipation, unquote. Marcuse looked especially to the marginalized and outcast left intellectual leadership, especially those trained in critical theory. Given the pervasiveness of capitalism's domination, the revolutionary vanguard can come only from those outcast intellectuals, especially among the younger students, those who are able to, quote, link liberation with the dissolution of ordinary and orderly perception, unquote, and who thereby can see through the appearance of peace to the reality of oppression, who have retained enough of their humanity not to have been turned into Joe's six-pack, and, above all, who have the will and the energy to do anything it takes, even to the point of being, quote, militantly intolerant and disobedient, unquote, to shock the capitalist power structure into revealing its true nature, thus toppling and smashing the system to pieces, leaving the way open for a renewal of humanity through socialism. Marcuse's reign as the preeminent philosopher of the New Left signaled a strong turn towards irrationality and violence among younger leftists. Quote, Marx, Marcuse, and Mao, unquote, became the new trinity and the slogan to rally under, as was proclaimed on a banner of students involved in closing the University of Rome, quote, Marx is the prophet, Marcuse is his interpreter, and Mao is the sword, unquote. Many in the new generation listened attentively and sharpened their swords. The rise and fall of left terrorism. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, 5 crucial elements coalesced and turned elements of the far left into a movement committed to revolutionary violence. Epistemologically, the prevailing academic and intellectual climate was either anti-reason, ineffectual in defending reason, or saw reason as irrelevant to practical matters. Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Kuhn spoke the new language of thought. Reason is out, the intellectuals were teaching, and what matters above all is will, authentic passion, and non-rational commitment. Practically, after a century of waiting for the revolution, impatience had peaked. Among the younger generation especially, there was a dominant bent toward activism and away from academic theorizing. Theoreticians still had an audience, but theory had not amounted to much. What was needed was decisive action now. Morally, there was the extreme disappointment at the failure of the classical socialist ideal. The great ideal of Marxism had failed to materialize. The purity of Marxist theory had been subjected to necessary but defiling revisions. The noble experiment in the Soviet Union had been revealed to be a horrible fraud and a crime. As a response to these crushing and humiliating blows, rage at the failure and betrayal of a utopian dream was widespread. Psychologically, in addition to the rage of disappointment, there was the supreme insult of seeing the hated enemy flourishing. Capitalism was enjoying itself, prospering, and even smirking at socialism's discomforts and disorientation. In the face of such insults, there was the desire to do nothing more than to smash the enemy, to see it hurt, bleeding, destroyed. Politically, there was the justification of irrational violence in the theories of the Frankfurt School as applied by Marcuse. The righteous revolutionary knows that the masses are oppressed, but held captive by the veil of capitalist false consciousness. The revolutionary knows that it will take individuals with special insight, special individuals immune to the corruptions of capitalism, special individuals able to gaze right through its veil of repressive tolerance, absolutely rejecting compromise, and willing to do anything to rip away the veil and expose the seething horrors below. The rise of left terrorism in the 1960s was one consequence. Chart: Left terrorist groups' founding dates. Weatherman, USA, 1960. United Red Army, Japan, 1960s. Black Panthers, USA, 1960s. SWAPO, Southwest Africa, 1960s. ALN, Brazil, 1960s. Tupamaros, Uruguay, 1962, active after 1968. FLQ, Canada, 1963. PLO, Middle East, 1964. Montoneros, Argentina, 1960s. ERP, Argentina, 1960s. Red Brigade, Italy, 1968. PFLP, Middle East, 1968. DPFLP, Middle East, 1968. Red Army Faction, or Baader-Meinhof, Germany, 1970. Black September, Middle East, 1970. SLA, USA, early 1970s. The founding dates of some of these terrorist groups are obscure. All, however, were explicitly Marxist socialist, and none had existed prior to 1960. Some of the groups also had strong nationalistic overtones. Not included in the chart, however, are terrorist groups that had begun earlier for primarily nationalist or religious reasons, but in the 1960s come to incorporate Marxism into their theories and manifestos. In addition to the 5 factors listed above, several particular events served as triggers in causing the upsurge in violence. Among the far left, the death of Che Guevara in 1967 and the failure of the 1968 student demonstrations in most Western nations, and especially of the student revolts in France, contributed to the anger and disappointment. Several of the terrorist manifestos published after 1968 make explicit mention of those events, as well as reflecting the broader themes of irrational will, exploitation, commodification, rage, and the need simply to do something. For example, Pierre Victor, then the leader of the French Maoists with whom Michel Foucault was associated, hearkened back to the French Revolution's reign of terror and declared the following in the pages of La Cause du Peuple, the Maoist newspaper, quote, "To overthrow the authority of the bourgeois class, the humiliated population has reason to institute a brief period of terror and to assault bodily a handful of contemptible, hateful individuals. It is difficult to attack the authority of a class without a few heads belonging to members of this class being paraded on the end of a stake." Other terrorists cast their nets more broadly. Before her death, Ulrike Meinhof made very clear the purpose of the Red Army faction she and Andreas Bader founded in Germany. Quote, "The anti-imperialist struggle, if it is to be more than a mere chatter, means annihilation, destruction, the shattering of the imperialist power structure, political, economic, and military." She also made clear the broader historical context within which she thought terrorism was necessary, the more specific events that had served as triggers, and gave an assessment of the likelihood of their success. Quote, "Nauseated by the proliferation of the conditions they found in the system, the total commercialization and absolute mendacity in all areas of the superstructure, deeply disappointed by the actions of the student movement and the extra-parliamentary opposition, they thought it essential to spread the idea of armed struggle. Not because they were so blind as to believe they could keep that initiative going until the revolution triumphed in Germany, not because they imagined they could not be shot or arrested, not because they so misjudged the situation as to think the masses would simply rise at such a signal. It was a matter of salvaging, historically, the whole state of understanding attained by the movement of 1960-1968. It was a case of not letting the struggle fall apart again." Unquote. The rise of left terrorism in nations other than those controlled by explicitly Marxist governments was a striking feature of the 1960s and early 1970s. Combined with the broader turn of the left to non-rationalism, irrationalism, and physical activism, the terrorist movement made that era the most confrontational and bloody in the history of left socialist movements of those nations. But the liberal capitalists were not entirely soft and complacent, and by the mid-1970s their police and military forces had defeated the terrorists, killing some, imprisoning many, driving others underground more or less permanently. From the collapse of the New Left to postmodernism. With the collapse of the New Left, the socialist movement was dispirited and in disarray. No one was waiting expectantly for socialism to materialize. No one thought it could be achieved by appealing to the electorate. No one was in a position to mount a coup, and those willing to use violence were dead, in jail, or underground. What then was to be the next step for socialism? In 1974, Herbert Marcuse was asked whether he thought the New Left was history. He replied, quote, "I don't think it's dead, and it will resurrect in the universities." Unquote. With hindsight, we can identify those who came to prominence as leaders of the postmodern movement: Michel Foucault, Jean-François Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, and Richard Rorty. But we can ask now, why those four? For all four, the personal and the professional are tightly linked, so a few biographical details are relevant. Foucault was born in 1926. He studied philosophy and psychology, receiving degrees from the École Normale Supérieure and the Sorbonne. He was a member of the French Communist Party from 1950 to 1953, but left over differences that eventually led him to declare himself a Maoist in 1968. Lyotard was born in 1924. Before turning to professional philosophy, he spent 12 years doing theoretical and practical work for the radical left group Socialism ou Barbarie. He finished his formal training in philosophy in 1958. Derrida was born in 1930. He began his formal study of philosophy in 1952 at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where he studied under Foucault. He associated closely with a group focused around Tel Quel, a far-left journal, and while sympathetic to the French Communist Party, he did not go so far as to join. Rorty was born in 1931. He received his PhD in philosophy from Yale in 1956. Not as far-left politically as the other three, Rorty is a strong social democrat who cites Socialist Party candidate and union leader A. Philip Randolph, for whom his parents worked for a time, as one of his great heroes. All four of these postmodernists were born within a 7-year span. All were well-trained in philosophy at the best schools. All entered their academic careers in the 1950s. All were strongly committed to left politics. All were well aware of the history of socialist theory and practice. All lived through the crises of socialism of the 1950s and the 1960s. And come the end of the 1960s and early 1970s, all four had high standing in their professional academic disciplines and high standing among the intellectual left. Accordingly, in the 1970s, as the far left collapsed once again, it turned to those best able to think strategically, those best able to situate the left historically and politically, and those most up to speed on the latest trends in epistemology and the state of knowledge. Foucault, Lyotard, Derrida, and Rorty proved themselves by those criteria. Accordingly, it was those four who signaled the new direction for the academic left. If one is an academic foe of capitalism, then one's weapons and tactics are not those of the politician, the activist, the revolutionary, or the terrorist. Academics' only possible weapons are words. And if one's epistemology tells one that words are not about truth or reality or in any way cognitive, then in the battle against capitalism, words can only be a rhetorical weapon. The next question then is how postmodern epistemology comes to be integrated with postmodern politics. End of Chapter 5. For a summary chart of the argument of Chapter 5, The Evolution of Socialist Strategies, see www.stephenhicks.org and search for The Evolution of Socialist Strategies. Explaining Postmodernism, Chapter 6, Postmodern Strategy, Connecting Epistemology to Politics. We are now in a position to address the question posed at the end of Chapter 1. Why has a leading segment of the political left adopted skeptical and relativist epistemological strategies? Language is the center of postmodern epistemology. Moderns and postmoderns differ not only about content when arguing particular issues in philosophy, literature, and law. They also differ in the methods by which they employ language. Epistemology drives those differences. Epistemology asks two questions about language. What is language's connection to reality, and what is its connection to action? Epistemological questions about language are a subset of epistemological questions about consciousness in general. What is consciousness's connection to reality, and what is its connection to action? Moderns and postmoderns have radically different answers to those questions. For the modern realists, Consciousness is both cognitive and functional, and those two traits are integrated. The primary purpose of consciousness is to be aware of reality. The complementary purpose of consciousness is to use its awareness of reality as a guide to acting in that reality. For the postmodern anti-realists, by contrast, consciousness is functional, but it is not cognitive. So its functionality has nothing to do with cognition. Two key concepts in the postmodern lexicon, unmasking and rhetoric, illustrate the significance of the differences. Unmasking and rhetoric. To the modernist, the mask metaphor is a recognition of the fact that words are not always to be taken literally, or as directly stating a fact, that people can use language elliptically, metaphorically, or to state falsehoods, that language can be textured with layers of meaning, and that it can be used to cover hypocrisies or to rationalize. Accordingly, unmasking means interpreting or investigating to get to a literal meaning or fact of the matter. The process of unmasking is cognitive, guided by objective standards with the purpose of coming to an awareness of reality. For the postmodernist, by contrast, interpretation and investigation never terminate with reality. Language connects only with more language, never with a non-linguistic reality. In Jacques Derrida's words, quote, "The fact of language is probably the only fact ultimately to resist all parenthization," unquote. That is to say, we cannot get outside of language. Language is a, quote, internal, unquote, self-referential system, and there is no way to get, quote, external, unquote, to it. Although even to speak of internal and external is also meaningless on postmodern grounds. There is no non-linguistic standard to which to relate language. So there can be no standard by which to distinguish between the literal and the metaphorical, the true and the false. Deconstruction is therefore in principle an unending process. Unmasking does not even terminate in subjective beliefs and interests, for subjective contrasts to objective, and that too is a distinction that postmodernism denies. A, quote, subject's beliefs and interests, unquote, are themselves socio-linguistic constructions. So unmasking one piece of language to reveal an underlying subjective interest is only to reveal more language. And that language in turn can be unmasked to reveal more language, and so on. Language is masks all the way down. At any given time, however, a subject is a particular construction with a particular set of beliefs and interests, and the subject uses language to express and further those beliefs and interests. Language is thus functional, and this brings us to rhetoric. For the modernist, the functionality of language is complementary to its being cognitive. An individual observes reality perceptually, forms conceptual beliefs about reality on the basis of those perceptions, and then acts on reality on the basis of those perceptual and conceptual cognitive states. Some of those actions in the world are social interactions, and in some of those social interactions, language assumes a communicatory function. In communicating with each other, individuals narrate, argue, or otherwise attempt to pass on their cognitive beliefs about the world. Rhetoric, then, is an aspect of language's communicatory function, referring to those methods of using language that aid in the effectiveness of cognition during linguistic communication. For the postmodernist, by contrast, language cannot be cognitive because it does not connect to reality, whether to an external nature or an underlying self. Language is not about being aware of the world or about distinguishing the true from the false, or even about argument in the traditional sense of validity, soundness, and probability. Accordingly, postmodernism recasts the nature of rhetoric. Rhetoric is persuasion in the absence of cognition. Richard Rorty makes this point clear in his essay, The Contingency of Language. The failure of the realist position, Rorty argues, has shown that, quote, the world does not tell us what language games to play, unquote, and that, quote, human languages are human creations, unquote. The purpose of language is therefore not to argue in an attempt to prove or disprove anything. Accordingly, Rorty concludes, that is not what he is doing when he uses language to try to persuade us of his version of solidarity. Quote, "Conforming to my own precepts, I am not going to offer arguments against the vocabulary I want to replace. Instead, I am going to try to make the vocabulary I favor look attractive by showing how it may be used to describe a variety of topics." Unquote. The language here is of attractiveness in the absence of cognition, truth, or argument. By temperament and in the content of his politics, Rorty is the least extreme of the leading postmodernists. This is apparent in the kind of language he uses in his political discourse. Language is a tool of social interaction, and one's model of social interaction dictates what kind of tool language is used as. Rorty sees a great deal of pain and suffering in the world and much conflict between groups. So language is to him primarily a tool of conflict resolution. To that end, his language pushes, quote, empathy, sensitivity, and toleration, unquote. Although he also suggests that these virtues may apply only within the range of, quote, our ethnocentric predicament, unquote. Quoting again, "We must in practice privilege our own group," unquote. He writes, which implies that, quote, "there are lots of views which we simply cannot take seriously," unquote. Most other postmodernists, however, see the conflicts between groups as more brutal and our prospects for empathy as more severely limited than does Rorty. Using language as a tool of conflict resolution is therefore not on their horizon. In a conflict that cannot reach peaceful resolution, the kind of tool that one wants is a weapon. And so, given the conflict models of social relations that dominate postmodern discourse, it makes perfect sense that to most postmodernists, language is primarily a weapon. This explains the harsh nature of much postmodern rhetoric. The regular deployments of ad hominem, the setting up of straw men, and the regular attempts to silence opposing views are all logical consequences of the postmodern epistemology of language. Stanley Fish, as noted in Chapter 4, calls all opponents of racial preferences bigots and lumps them in with the Ku Klux Klan. Andrea Dworkin calls all heterosexual males rapists and repeatedly labels America with a K, a fascist state. With such rhetoric, truth or falsity is not the issue. What matters primarily is the language's effectiveness. If we now add to the postmodern epistemology of language the far-left politics of the leading postmodernists and their first-hand awareness of the crisis of socialist thought and practice, then the verbal weaponry has to become explosive. When theory clashes with fact. In the past 2 centuries, many strategies have been pursued by socialists the world over. Socialists have tried waiting for the masses to achieve socialism from the bottom up, and they have tried imposing socialism from the top down. They have tried to achieve it by evolution and by revolution. They have tried versions of socialism that emphasize industrialization, and they have tried those that are agrarian. They have waited for capitalism to collapse by itself, and when that did not happen, they have tried to destroy capitalism by peaceful means. And when that did not work, some have tried to destroy it by terrorism. But capitalism continues to do well, and socialism has been a disaster. In modern times, there have been over 2 centuries of socialist theory and practice, and the preponderance of logic and evidence has gone against socialism. There is, accordingly, a choice about what lesson to learn from history. If one is interested in truth, then one's rational response to a failing theory is as follows. One breaks the theory down to its constituent premises. One questions its premises vigorously and checks the logic that integrates them. One seeks out alternatives to the most questionable premises. One accepts moral responsibility for any bad consequences of putting the false theory into practice. This is not what we find in postmodern reflections on contemporary politics. Truth and rationality are subjected to attack, And the prevailing attitude about moral responsibility is again best stated by Rorty. Quote, "I think that a good left is a party that always thinks about the future and doesn't care much about our past sins." Unquote. Kierkegaardian postmodernism. In Chapter 4, I sketched one postmodern response to the problems of theory and evidence for socialism. For an intelligent, informed socialist confronted with the data of history, a crisis of belief has to occur. Socialism is to many a powerful vision of the beautiful society, one that envisages an ideal social world that will transcend all the ills of our current one. Any such deeply held vision comes to form part of the very identity of the believer, and any threat to the vision has to be experienced as a threat to the believer. From the historical experience of other visions that have run into crises of theory and evidence, we know that there can be a powerful temptation to block out theoretical and evidentiary problems and simply to will oneself into continuing to believe. Religion, for example, has provided many such instances. Quote, 10,000 difficulties, wrote Cardinal Newman, do not make one doubt. Unquote. Fyodor Dostoevsky made the point more starkly in a letter to a woman benefactor. Quote, "If anyone had written to me that the truth was outside of Christ, I would rather remain with Christ than with the truth." Unquote. We also know from historical experience that sophisticated epistemological strategies can be developed precisely for the purpose of attacking the reason and logic that have caused problems for the vision. Such were part of the explicit motivation of Kant's first critique, Schleiermacher's On Religion, and Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. Why not for the far left? The modern histories of religion and socialism exhibit striking parallels in development. Both religion and socialism started with a comprehensive vision that they believed to be true but not based on reason. Various prophets, Rousseau. Both visions were then challenged by visions based on rational epistemologies. Early naturalist critics of religion, early liberal critics of socialism. Both religion and socialism responded by saying that they could satisfy the criteria of reason, natural theology, scientific socialism. Both religion and socialism then ran into serious problems of logic and evidence. Hume's attack on natural theology, Mises and Hayek's attacks on socialist calculation. Both then responded in turn by attacking reality and reason, Kant and Kierkegaard, the postmodernists. By the end of the 18th century, religious thinkers had available to them Kant's sophisticated epistemology. Kant told them that reason was cut off from reality, and so many abandoned natural theology and gratefully used his epistemology to defend religion. By the middle of the 20th century, left thinkers had available to them sophisticated theories of epistemology and language that told them that truth is impossible, that evidence is theory-laden, that empirical evidence never adds up to proof, that logical proof is merely theoretical, that reason is artificial and dehumanizing, and that one's feelings and passions are better guides than reason. The prevailing skeptical and irrationalist epistemologies in academic philosophy thus provided the left with a new strategy for responding to its crisis. Any attack on socialism in any form could be brushed aside, and the desire to believe in it reaffirmed. Those who adopted this strategy could always tell themselves that they were simply functioning as Kuhn said the scientists themselves function, by bracketing the anomalies, setting them aside, and then going with their feelings. On this hypothesis, then, postmodernism is a symptom of the far left's crisis of faith. Postmodernism is a result of using skeptical epistemology to justify the personal leap of faith necessary to continue believing in socialism. On this hypothesis, the prevalence of skeptical and irrationalist epistemologies in the middle of the 20th century alone is not a sufficient explanation of postmodernism. A dead end of skepticism and irrationalism does not predict to what uses skepticism and irrationalism will be put. A desperate person or movement can appeal to those epistemologies as a defense mechanism, but who or what movement is desperate depends on other factors. In this case, socialism is the movement in trouble. But socialism's troubles alone are not a sufficient explanation either. Unless the epistemological groundwork is laid, any movement that appeals to skeptical and irrationalist arguments will simply be laughed out of court. Therefore, it is a combination of the two factors: widespread skepticism about reason and socialism's being in crisis that is necessary to give rise to postmodernism. Yet this Kierkegaardian explanation of postmodernism is incomplete as an account of postmodern strategy. For left thinkers who are crushed by the failings of socialism, the Kierkegaardian option provides the justification needed for continuing to believe in socialism as a matter of personal faith. But for those who still want to carry on the battle against capitalism, the new epistemologies make other strategies possible. Reversing Thrasymachus. So far, my argument accounts for postmodernism's subjectivism and relativism, its left-wing politics, and the need to connect the two. If this explanation is correct, then postmodernism is what I call reverse Thrasymachianism, alluding to the sophist Thrasymachus of Plato's Republic. Some postmodernists see part of their project as rehabilitating the sophists, and this makes perfect sense. One could, after doing some philosophy, come to be a true believer in subjectivism and relativism. Accordingly, one could come to believe that reason is derivative, that will and desire rule, that society is a battle of competing wills, that words are merely tools in the power struggle for dominance, and that all is fair in love and war. That is the position the sophists argued 2,400 years ago. The only difference, then, between the sophists and the postmodernists is whose side they're on. Thrasymachus was representative of the second and cruder generation of sophists, marshalling subjectivist and relativistic arguments in support of the political claim that justice is the interest of the stronger. The postmodernists, coming after 2 millennia of Christianity and 2 centuries of socialist theory, simply reverse that claim. Subjectivism and relativism are true, except that the postmodernists are on the side of the weaker and historically oppressed groups. Justice, contrary to Thrasymachus, is the interest of the weaker. The connection to the sophists moves postmodern strategy away from religious faith and toward realpolitik. The sophists taught rhetoric not as a means of advancing truth and knowledge, but as a means of winning debates in the rough-and-tumble world of day-to-day politics. Day-to-day politics is not a place where faithfully blinding oneself to the data leads to practical success. Rather, it requires an openness to new realities and the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. Extending that flexibility to include not being concerned for truth or consistency in argument can and often has been seen as part of a strategy for achieving political success. Here, it is useful to recall Frank Lantricchia. Postmodernism, quote, seeks not to find the foundation and the conditions of truth, but to exercise power for the purpose of social change, unquote. Using contradictory discourses as a political strategy. In postmodern discourse, truth is rejected explicitly, and consistency can be a rare phenomenon. Consider the following pairs of claims. On the one hand, all truth is relative. On the other hand, postmodernism tells it like it really is. On the one hand, all cultures are equally deserving of respect. On the other, Western culture is uniquely destructive and bad. Values are subjective, but racism and sexism are really evil. Technology is bad and destructive, and it is unfair that some people have more technology than others. Tolerance is good, and dominance is bad, but when postmodernists come to power, political correctness follows. There is a common pattern here. Subjectivism and relativism in one breath, dogmatic absolutism in the next. Postmodernists are well aware of the contradictions, especially since their opponents relish pointing them out at every opportunity. And of course, a postmodernist can respond dismissingly by citing Hegel, quote, "Those are merely Aristotelian logical contradictions," unquote. But it is one thing to say that, and quite another thing to sustain Hegelian contradictions psychologically. The pattern therefore raises the question of which side of the contradiction is deepest for postmodernism. Is it that the postmodernists really are committed to relativism, but occasionally lapse into absolutism? Or are their absolutist commitments deepest, and the relativism a rhetorical cover? Consider three more examples, this time of clashes between postmodernist theory and historical fact. Postmodernists say that the West is deeply racist, but they know very well that the West ended slavery for the first time ever, and that it is only in places where Western ideas have made inroads that racist ideas are on the defensive. They say that the West is deeply sexist, but they know very well that Western women were the first to get the vote, contractual rights, and the opportunities that most women in the world are still without. They say that Western capitalist countries are cruel to their poorer members, subjugating them and getting rich off them. But they know very well that the poor in the West are far richer than the poor anywhere else, both in terms of material assets and the opportunities to improve their condition. In explaining the contradiction between the relativism and the absolutist politics, there are three possibilities. 1. The first possibility is that the relativism is primary and the absolutist politics are secondary. Qua philosophers, the postmodernists push relativism, but qua particular individuals, they happen to believe a particular version of absolutist politics. 2. The second possibility is that the absolutist politics are primary, while the relativism is a rhetorical strategy that is used to advance the politics. 3. The third possibility is that both the relativism and the absolutism coexist in postmodernism, but the contradictions between them simply do not matter psychologically to those who hold them. The first option can be ruled out as a possibility. Subjectivism and its consequent relativism cannot be primary to postmodernism because of the uniformity of the politics of postmodernism. If subjectivity and relativism were primary, then the postmodernists would be adopting political positions across the spectrum, and that simply is not happening. Postmodernism is therefore first a political movement and a brand of politics that has only lately come to relativism. Machiavellian postmodernism. So let us try the second option, that postmodernism is first about politics and only secondly about relativistic epistemology. Frederick Jameson's oft-quoted line, quote, "Everything is in the last analysis political," unquote, should then be given a strongly Machiavellian twist as a statement of a willingness to use any weapon, rhetorical, epistemological, political, to achieve political ends. Then, strikingly, postmodernism turns out not to be relativistic at all. Relativism becomes part of a rhetorical political strategy, some Machiavellian realpolitik employed to throw the opposition off track. On this hypothesis, postmodernists need not believe much of what they say. The word games and much of the use of anger and rage that are characteristic of much of their style can be a matter not of using words to state things that they think are true, but rather of using words as a weapon against an enemy that they still hope to destroy. Here it is useful to recall Derrida, quote, "Deconstruction never had meaning or interest, at least in my eyes, than as a radicalization, that is to say, also within the tradition of a certain Marxism, in a certain spirit of Marxism," unquote. Machiavellian rhetorical discourses. Suppose that you are arguing about politics with a fellow student or professor. You cannot believe it, but you seem to be losing the debate. All of your argumentative gambits are blocked, and you keep getting backed into corners. Feeling trapped, you then find yourself saying, "Well, it's all just a matter of opinion, it's merely semantics," unquote. What is the purpose in this context of appealing to opinion and semantic relativism? The purpose is to get your opponent off your back and to get some breathing space. If your opponent accepts that the debate is a matter of opinion or semantics, then your losing the argument does not matter. Nobody is right or wrong. But if your opponent does not accept that everything is a matter of opinion, then his attention is diverted away from the subject matter at hand, namely politics, and into epistemology. For now he has to show why everything is not merely semantics, and that will take him a while. Meanwhile, you have successfully diverted him. And if it looks like he is doing a good job on the semantics argument, then you can throw in, well, what about perceptual illusions? In adopting this rhetorical strategy, do you really have to believe that everything is a matter of opinion or merely semantics? No, you do not. You can believe absolutely that you are right about the politics, and you can know that all you want to do is use words to get the guy off your back in a way that makes it seem like you have not lost the argument. This rhetorical strategy also works at the level of intellectual movements. Foucault has identified the strategy explicitly and clearly. Quote, discourses are tactical elements or blocks operating in the field of force relations. There can exist different and even contradictory discourses within the same strategy. Unquote. Deconstruction as an educational strategy. Here is an example. Kate Ellis is a radical gender feminist. Ellis, as she writes in Socialist Review, believes that sexism is evil, that affirmative action is good, that capitalism and sexism go hand in hand, and that achieving equality between the sexes requires an overthrow of existing society. But she finds that she has a problem when she tries to teach these themes to her students. She finds that they think like liberal capitalists. They think in terms of equality of opportunity, in terms of simply removing artificial barriers and judging everyone by the same standards. And they think that by personal effort and ambition, they can overcome most obstacles and achieve success in life. But this means that her students have bought into the whole liberal capitalist framework that Ellis thinks is dead wrong. So, Ellis writes, she will enlist deconstruction as a weapon against those old-fashioned Enlightenment beliefs. If she can first undermine her students' belief in the superiority of capitalist values and of the idea that people make or break themselves, then their core values will be destabilized. Pushing relativism, she finds, helps achieve this. And once their Enlightenment beliefs are hollowed out by relativistic arguments, she can fill the void with the correct left political principles. A familiar analogy may help here. On this hypothesis, postmodernists are no more relativistic than creationists are in their battles against evolutionary theory. Postmodernists, wearing their multiculturalist garb and saying that all cultures are equal, are like those creationists who say that all they want is equal time for evolutionism and creationism. Creationists will sometimes argue that creationism and evolutionism are equally scientific or equally religious, and that they should therefore be treated equally and given equal time. Do creationists really believe that? Is equal time all that they want? Of course not. Creationists are fundamentally opposed to evolution. They are convinced that it is wrong and evil, and if they were in power, they would suppress it. However, as a short-term tactic, as long as they are on the losing side of the intellectual debate, they will push intellectual egalitarianism and argue that nobody really knows the absolute truth. The same strategy holds for the Machiavellian postmodernists. They say that they want equal respect for all cultures, but what they really want in the long run is to suppress the liberal capitalist one. The Machiavellian interpretation also explains the use that postmodernists sometimes make of science. Einstein's relativity theory, quantum mechanics, chaos mathematics, and Gödel's incompleteness theorem will all be cited regularly as proving that everything is relative, that nothing can be known, that everything is chaos. At best, in postmodernist writings, one will read dubious interpretations of the data, but more commonly the person involved does not have a clear idea of what the theorem in question is or how it is proved. This is especially clear in the infamous case of physicist Alan Sokal and the far-left journal Social Text. Sokal published an article in Social Text in which he argued that science had discredited the Enlightenment view of an objective, knowable reality, and that the latest results from quantum physics supported far-left politics. Sokal announced simultaneously in lingua franca that the article was a parody of postmodern criticism of science. The shocked reaction of the editors and defenders of social text was not to argue that they thought the physics presented in the article is true or even a legitimate interpretation. Instead, the editors were deeply embarrassed and at the same time suggested piously that it was Sokal who had violated the sacred bonds of academic honesty and integrity. It was clear, however, that the editors did not know much about the physics and that the article had been published because of the political mileage they could get out of it. The Machiavellian interpretation also explains why relativistic arguments are arrayed only against the Western great books canon. If one's deepest goals are political, one always has a major obstacle to deal with: the powerful books written by brilliant minds on the other side of the debate. In literature, there is a huge body of novels, plays, epic poems, and not much of it supports socialism. Much of it presents compelling analyses of the human condition from opposed perspectives. In American law, there is the Constitution and the whole body of common law precedent, and very little of that supports socialism. Consequently, if you are a left-wing graduate student or professor in literature or law, and you are confronted with the Western legal or literary canon, you have two choices. You can take on the opposing traditions, have your students read the great books and the great decisions, and argue with them in your classes. That is very hard work and also very risky. Your students might come to agree with the wrong side. Or you can find a way to dismiss the whole tradition so that you can teach only books that fit your politics. If you are looking for shortcuts, or if you have a sneaking suspicion that the right side might not fare well in the debate, then deconstruction is seductive. Deconstruction allows you to dismiss whole literary and legal traditions as built upon sexist or racist or otherwise exploitative assumptions. It provides a justification for setting them aside. However, in order to use this strategy, do you really have to believe that Shakespeare was a misogynist, that Hawthorne was a secret Puritan, or that Melville was a technological imperialist? No. Deconstruction can simply be employed as a rhetorical method for ridding oneself of an obstacle. On this Machiavellian hypothesis, then, postmodernism is not a leap of faith for the academic left, but instead a clear-eyed political strategy that uses relativism but does not believe it. Ressentiment, postmodernism. A psychologically darker streak runs through postmodernism, one that none of the above explanations has so far captured. The above explain postmodernism as a response to extreme skepticism, as a faith response to the crisis of a political vision, or as an unscrupulous political strategy. Those explanations connect the epistemology and the politics of postmodernism, and they resolve the tension between the relativist and absolutist elements of postmodernism. In the Kantian explanation of postmodernism, the tension is resolved by making the skepticism primary and the political commitments secondary and accidentally associated. In the Kierkegaardian and Machiavellian explanations, the tension is resolved by making the political commitments primary and the use of relativistic epistemology a matter of rationalization or political rhetorical strategy. The final option is not to resolve the tension. Contradiction is a psychological form of destruction, but contradictions sometimes do not matter psychologically to those who live them, because for them ultimately nothing matters. Nihilism is close to the surface in the postmodern intellectual movement in a historically unprecedented way. In the modern world, left-wing thought has been one of the major breeding grounds for destruction and nihilism. From the Reign of Terror, to Lenin and Stalin, to Mao and Pol Pot, to the upsurge of terrorism in the 1960s and 1970s, the far left has exhibited repeatedly a willingness to use violence to achieve political ends, and exhibited extreme frustration and rage when it has failed. The left has also included many fellow travelers from the same political and psychological universe, but without political power at their disposal. Herbert Marcuse, with his explicit call to use philosophy to achieve, quote, absolute annihilation of the common sense world, unquote, was only a recent and unusually explicit voice. It is that history of left thought and practice that more moderate left voices, such as Michael Harrington's, took pains to warn us about. Reflecting on that history, Harrington wrote, quote, I want to avoid that absolutist view of socialism that makes it so transcendent that true believers are driven to totalitarian rage in the effort to create a perfect order. From totalitarian rage to nihilism is a short step. As Nietzsche noted in Daybreak, quote, when some men fail to accomplish what they desire to do, they exclaim angrily, may the whole world perish. This repulsive emotion is the pinnacle of envy, whose implication is, if I cannot have something, no one can have anything. No one is to be anything, unquote. Nietzschean ressentiment. Nietzsche, paradoxically, is one of the great postmodernist heroes. They cite him for his perspectivalism in epistemology, for his use of the enigmatic and loosely structured aphoristic form instead of the more scientific treatise form, and for his psychological acuteness in diagnosing decay and hypocrisy. I want to use Nietzsche against the postmodernists for a change. Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment is close to the English resentment, but with a more curdled bitterness, more seething and poisoned and bottled up for a long time. Nietzsche uses ressentiment in the context of developing his famous account of master and slave morality in Beyond Good and Evil, and more systematically in Genealogy of Morals. Master morality is the morality of the vigorous, life-loving strong. It is the morality of those who love adventure, who delight in creativity and in their own sense of purposefulness and assertiveness. Slave morality is the morality of the weak, the humble, those who feel victimized and afraid to venture forth into the big bad world. Weaklings are chronically passive, mostly because they're afraid of the strong. As a result, the weak feel frustrated. They cannot get what they want out of life. They become envious of the strong. And they also secretly start to hate themselves for being so cowardly and weak. But no one can live thinking he or she is hateful. And so the weak invent a rationalization that tells them that they are the good and the moral because they are weak, humble, and passive. Patience is a virtue, they say, and so is humility, and so is obedience, and so is being on the side of the weak and the downtrodden. And of course, the opposites of those things are evil. Aggressiveness is evil, and so is pride, and so is independence, and so is being physically and materially successful. But of course, it's a rationalization, and a smart weakling is never quite going to convince himself of it. That will do damage inside. Meanwhile, the strong will be laughing at him, and that will do damage inside. And the strong and the rich will be carrying on, getting stronger and richer and enjoying life. And seeing that will do damage inside. Eventually, the smart weakling will feel such a combination of self-loathing and envy of his enemies that he will need to lash out. He will feel the urge to hurt in any way he can his hated enemy. But of course, he cannot risk direct physical confrontation. He is a weakling. His only weapons are words. And so, Nietzsche argued, the weakling becomes extremely clever with words. In our time, the world created by the Enlightenment is strong, active, and exuberant. For a while in the past century, socialists could believe that the revolution was coming, that woe would come to them that are rich, and that blessed would be the poor. But that hope has been dashed cruelly. Capitalism now seems like a case of twice two makes four, and like Dostoevsky's Underground Man, it is easy to see that the most intelligent socialists would just hate that fact. Socialism is the historical loser, and if socialists know that, they will hate that fact, they will hate the winners for having won, and they will hate themselves for having picked the losing side. Hate, as a chronic condition, leads to the urge to destroy. Yet political failure is too limited as an explanation for the range of nihilistic themes found in postmodernism. Postmodern thinkers hold that not just politics has failed, everything has failed. Being, as Hegel and Heidegger taught us, really has come to nothing. Postmodernism, then, in its most extreme forms, is about driving that point home and making the nothing reign. Clearly, I am flirting with ad hominem here, so I will let the postmodernists speak for themselves. Foucault and Derrida on the End of Man. In his Introduction to the Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault speaks at one point in the first person. Speaking autobiographically about his motivations for writing, Foucault speaks of his desire to erase himself. Quote, "I can lose myself and appear at last to eyes that I will never have to meet again. I am no doubt not the only one who writes in order to have no face." Unquote. Foucault extends his desire for effacement to the entire human species. At the end of The Order of Things, for example, he speaks almost longingly about the coming erasure of mankind. Man is, quote, "an invention of recent date that will soon be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea." Unquote. God is dead, wrote Hegel and Nietzsche. Man, too, will be dead, Foucault hopes. Derrida, too, recognizes the kind of world that postmodernism is bringing about and declares his intention not to be among those who let their queasiness get the better of them. Postmodernists, he writes, are those who do not, quote, "turn their eyes away when faced by the as yet unnameable which is proclaiming itself, and which can do so, as is necessary whenever a birth is in the offing, only under the species of the non-species, in the formless, mute, infant, and terrifying form of monstrosity." Unquote. The bringing forth of monsters is one postmodern view of the creative process, one that heralds the end of mankind. Other postmodernists stress the ugliness of postmodern creation, at the same time suggesting that mankind is simply beside the point. Kate Ellis notes, for example, quote, "the characteristically apolitical pessimism of most postmodernism, by which creation is simply a form of defecation." Unquote. Monsters and waste products were core themes in the world of art in the 20th century, and there is an instructive parallel between developments in the world of art in the first half of the century and developments in the rest of the humanities in the second half of the century. With Marcel Duchamp, the world of art got to postmodernism before the rest of the intellectual world. Asked to submit something for display by the Society of Independent Artists in New York, Duchamp sent a urinal. Duchamp, of course, knew the history of art. He knew what had been achieved, how over the centuries art had been a powerful vehicle that called upon the highest development of the human creative vision and demanded exacting technical skill. And he knew that art had an awesome power to exalt the senses, the intellects, and the passions of those who experience it. Duchamp reflected on the history of art and decided to make a statement. The artist is not a great creator. Duchamp went shopping at a plumbing store. The artwork is not a special object. It was mass-produced in a factory. The experience of art is not exciting and ennobling. At best, it is puzzling and mostly leaves one with a sense of distaste. But over and above that, Duchamp did not select just any ready-made object to display. In selecting the urinal, his message was clear. Art is something you piss on. Dada's themes are about meaningless, but its works and manifestos are meaningful philosophical statements in the context in which they are presented. Kunst ist Scheiße, art is shit, was fittingly the motto of the Dada movement. Duchamp's urinal was the fitting symbol. Everything is waste to be flushed away. On this hypothesis, then, postmodernism is a generalization on Dada's nihilism. Not only is art shit, everything is. Postmodern thinkers inherit an intellectual tradition that has seen the defeat of all of its major hopes. The Counter-Enlightenment was from the beginning suspicious of the Enlightenment's naturalism, its reason, its optimistic view of human potential, its individualism in ethics and politics, and its science and technology. For those opposed to the Enlightenment, the modern world has offered no comfort. The advocates of the Enlightenment said that science was to be the replacement for religion, but science has offered the specters of entropy and relativity. Science was to be the glory of mankind, but it has taught us that man evolved, red in tooth and claw, from the ooze. Science was to make the world a technological paradise, but it has generated nuclear bombs and super bacilli. And the confidence in the power of reason that underlies it all has, from the postmodernist's perspective, been revealed to be a fraud. The thought of nuclear weapons in the hands of an irrational, grasping animal is frightening. While the neo-Enlightenment thinkers have come to terms with the modern world, from the postmodern perspective, the universe has been metaphysically and epistemologically shattered. We cannot turn to God or to nature, and we cannot trust reason or mankind. But there was always socialism. As bad as the philosophical universe became in metaphysics, epistemology, and the study of human nature, there was still the vision of an ethical and political order that would transcend everything and create the beautiful collectivist society. The failure of left politics to achieve that vision was merely the last straw. To the postmodern mind, the cruel lessons of the modern world are that reality is inaccessible, that nothing can be known, that human potential is nothing, and that ethical and political ideals have come to nothing. The psychological response to the loss of everything is anger and despair. But the postmodern thinkers also find themselves surrounded by an Enlightenment world that does not understand. The postmodernists find themselves confronting a world dominated by liberalism and capitalism, by science and technology, by people who still believe in reality and reason and in the greatness of human potential. The world that they said was impossible and destructive has both come to be and is flourishing. The heirs of the Enlightenment are running the world, and they have marginalized the postmodernists to the academy. Ressentiment is then added to anger and despair. Some retreat into quietism, and some retreat to a private world of aesthetic play and self-creation. Others, however, lash out with the intent to destroy. But again, postmodernism's only weapons are words. Ressentiment's strategy. The 20th century art world again gives prescient examples. Duchamp's urinal sent the message, "Piss on you," and his later works put that general attitude into practice. His version of the Mona Lisa was a clear example, a reproduction of Leonardo's masterpiece with a cartoonish mustache added. That too made a statement. Here is a magnificent achievement that I cannot hope to equal, so instead I will deface it and turn it into a joke. Robert Rauschenberg took Duchamp a step further. Feeling that he was standing in the shadow of Willem de Kooning's achievements, he asked for one of de Kooning's paintings, which he then obliterated and then painted over. That made a statement. I cannot be special unless I destroy your achievement first. Deconstruction is a literary version of Duchamp and Rauschenberg. Deconstruction theory says that no work has meaning. Any apparent meaning can be transformed into its opposite, into nothing, or revealed to be a mask for something distasteful. The postmodern movement contains many people who like the idea of deconstructing other people's creative work. Deconstruction has the effect of leveling all meaning and value. If a text can mean anything, then it means nothing more than anything else. No texts are then great. If a text is a cover for something fraudulent, then doubt about everything apparently great creeps in. That deconstructive techniques are arrayed primarily against works that do not square with postmodern commitments then makes sense. The strategy is not new. If you hate someone and want to hurt him, then hit him where it counts. Do you want to hurt a man who loves his children and hates child molesters? Drop hints and spread rumors that he is fond of child pornography. Do you want to hurt a woman who takes pride in her independence? Spread the word that she married the man she did because he is wealthy. The truth or falsity of the rumors does not matter, and whether those you tell believe you does not really matter. What matters is that you score a direct, damaging hit to someone's psyche. You know that those accusations and rumors will cause tremors, even if they come to nothing. You get the wonderfully dark glow inside of knowing that you did it, and the rumors might just come to something after all. The best portrait of this psychology comes from that very dead, very white European male, William Shakespeare, in his Othello. Iago just hated Othello, but he could not hope to defeat him in open confrontation. How then could he destroy him? Iago's strategy was to attack him where it would hurt most, through Othello's passion for Desdemona. Iago hinted indirectly that she had been sleeping around. He spread subtle lies and innuendo about her faithfulness. He succeeded in raising a doubt in Othello's mind about the most beautiful thing in his life, and he let that doubt work like a slow poison. Like the postmodernists, Iago's only weapons were words. The only difference is that the postmodernists are not so subtle about their intended targets. The contemporary Enlightenment world prides itself on its commitment to equality and justice, its open-mindedness, its making opportunity available to all, and its achievements in science and technology. The Enlightenment world is proud, confident, and knows it is the wave of the future. This is unbearable to someone who is totally invested in an opposed and failed outlook. That pride is what such a person wants to destroy. The best target to attack is the Enlightenment's sense of its own moral worth. Attack it as sexist and racist, intolerantly dogmatic, and cruelly exploitative. Undermine its confidence in its reason, its science and technology. The words do not even have to be true or consistent to do the necessary damage. And like Iago, postmodernism does not have to get the girl in the end. Destroying Othello is enough. Post-postmodernism. Showing that a movement leads to nihilism is an important part of understanding it, as is showing how a failing and nihilistic movement can still be dangerous. Tracing postmodernism's roots back to Rousseau, Kant, and Marx explains how all of its elements came to be woven together. Yet identifying postmodernism's roots and connecting them to contemporary bad consequences does not refute postmodernism. What is still needed is a refutation of those historical premises and an identification and defense of the alternatives to them. The Enlightenment was based on premises opposite to those of postmodernism. But while the Enlightenment was able to create a magnificent world on the basis of those premises, it articulated and defended them only incompletely. That weakness is the sole source of postmodernism's power against it. Completing the articulation and defense of those premises is therefore essential to maintaining the forward progress of the Enlightenment vision and shielding it against postmodern strategies. End of Chapter 6. End of Explaining Postmodernism.